It's been a long time since I've made a video. I'm exhausted. A lot of studying for me to do, so I'll just make this Turandot review, and there won't be another one for quite a while. But enjoy this for now. But before we go into the recordings, as usual, let's talk about the checkpoints for each character. Firstly, we have the title role of Turandot, but because basically everything she sings is with Kalaf, the other protagonist, that's why I'm going to group these two together and show you what you want to listen to in these two characters. Firstly, of course, is Turandot's entrance in Questa Regia aria and the famous, high C, double high C at the end of it with Kalaf. But there's much more to In Questa Regia than the high C, because what most people think when they go into a recording of Turandot, oh, I have to hear Kalaf do the high C with Turandot, I have to hear them blast it at full volume. Of course you do, but there's so much more to In Questa Regia than this. So I've got a recording of Birgit Nilsson, Moscow 1964, to demonstrate what you exactly want to listen to. So at the very start, Turandot is basically just narrating the history of the Princess Lo Ling, which has traumatized her, and that's why she isn't going to accept any suitors, and she's going to kill them all. At the start of the aria, it has to be a narrative and almost imposing voice narrating the story of Lo Wuling to Kalaf, because you have to hear the imposing quality. Imagine Turandot standing on the throne, looking down at Kalaf, trying to win her over, and she has to make herself known that no, she isn't going to take anything, and she's just going to start with a narrative kind of voice, just talking while before she gets to Principessa Lo Wuling. So you basically hear that at the very start, Nilsson just lays it out. In questa regia orson milani e mille, un grido disperato risuonò. Just a narrative saying that, in this palace thousands of years ago, a desperate cry rang out, and that cry after many generations took shelter in my spirit. You can hear that at the very end of her phrase, qui nell'anima mia si rifugio. She's trying to, transition into the next phrase, because what she talks next is, the serenity of Princess Lo Ling, and of course you need the nuance, you need the purity of the voice to do that, and let's see what she does with it. Again, you can hear a lot of nuance in these few phrases. Like, notice how she changes her tone when she mentions the princess, like Principessa Loweling, and then the sweet serene ancestress Ava dolce serena. There's the, sereneness in it. And then, che regnavi nel tuo cupo silenzio in gioia pura, who ruled in your dark silence with pure joy. And all of this is still very much covered and is still, presenting the sereneness of Princess Lo Ling. And then she has to make it more choppy here because what she sings next is, and challenge sure and unyielding, like inflessibile e sicura is, it needs to be more choppy. It needs to be delivered with force, with assertion. But then the next phrase, las predominio oggi rivivi in me, she switches to a very heavy chest voice, and that is because what she's singing here is saying the harsh domination. I mean, you have to hear the harshness, the heaviness, the seriousness, the graveness of that. So she dives down into her chest voice. You can hear, the tone change on oggi rivivi in me. She lightens her tone because that's where she starts talking about herself. And you have to hear the tone changes. You can't just yell it out. You can't just blast it out the whole phrase, because or else you don't have the whole trauma and the whole picture of Turandot and the history of why she's going to kill every single man she comes across. And then we'll skip a bit and go directly to here. Obviously, we can hear she engages a lot of chest voice here. She's pushing up her chest voice a lot, because what she's singing here is, "Oh, you princes with your caravans from every part of the world, who come here to try your fate. In you I avenge that purity, that cry, and that death." Very threatening words, and of course you have to impose yourself. You have to push your chest voice up so that it sounds threatening, imposing, and that's what Liu Song does completely. And those few words at the very end, that cry and that death, quel grado e quella morte. She just skips the consonants and just cries, just yells out a B natural, which is that cry. She does that. But what I prefer actually is Ava Turner singing this phrase. The way she goes, quel grado e quella morte, makes your hair stands, absolutely electrifying singing. And then what happens next after that violin comes in and with that theme is, no one will ever possess me. The horror of her assassin is still vivid in my heart. No one will ever possess me. In me is reborn the pride of such purity. So she's no longer being assertive. She's just saying that she is expressing her own feelings, her own disdain towards this entire situation. And that's why you come in with a lot of, with a lot of expression here, which is what Nilsson does. I'll going back to that recording. So you can hear what she does with the two phrases. L'orror di chi l'uccise, vivo nel cor mi sta. The horror of her assassin is still vivid in my heart. You can hear the amount of chest voice she puts on vivo nel cor mi sta. Like, still in my heart. The horror is still in my heart. And that to mi sta, that chest voice is amazing. And then she has to go absolutely dominant, absolutely assertive, because in me is reborn the pride of such purity. The pride, the ego has to be there. She has to blast Khalaf away, blast everyone away, and that's why you go cold and just blast up as much voice as you can. And that is what Nilsson does with this Rinasce in me l'orgoglio di tanta purità, with the two B naturals that she just blasts out from her throat, metallic laser beam notes at full volume. And then comes the famous Gli enigmi sono tre. I don't think I have explained on this one. Turandot says that death is one of the enigmas. Khalaf replies with, one is life, and they join together and climb to that high sea. I don't think it needs any explaining why you need to be out singing the other one. And both of them have to be at full volume, matching one another, and none of them should be louder than one another because they're having a battle. It hasn't been decided yet, and both are putting in their full volume to try and beat the other one. And Nilsson and Corelli have been doing that for more than a decade. That's what I call a properly matched, battle on this high sea. This battle of the titans. It's two giants, Turandot and Khalaf. You have to come together and you have to match one another at full volume, and this is why it's so electrifying, this moment. But I'm not done yet. There's much more to Turandot and Khalaf than this particular scene. Of course, you have the long discourse at the riddle scene where they guess and stuff. But what I'm going to talk about is what comes after the riddle scene. And what that is Turandot's plead to her father to not let her marry, and Khalaf's response of no, I want to fill you with love, and if you don't find out my name by dawn, I will die. And so it's that discourse that matters, not the riddle scene, actual riddle scene, is what happens after Calaf solves these 3 riddles. We'll start from Figlio del Cielo, Turandot's line, and I'll take this recording from 1966 with Anna Di Cavalieri and Daniele Barioni. So this minute or so of singing, very desperate Turandot. She has been this really cruel and ice-cold princess, right? But here, in front of her father and in front of confronting her fears, she has to sound very desperate, and it's hard for a massive voice to sound desperate and trying to convince, trying to move her father, and it takes nuance. It takes some gentleness, some velvety voice to be able to convey the kind of desperate and trying to move her father, the quality of that. And that's what Cavalieri does with legato and with a smooth and creamy vocal line. But then because what she's singing here is son of heaven, don't cast your daughter into the stranger's arms. You can't give me to him like a slave to die of shame. But after talking to her father, and the emperor is like, the oath is sacred, she turns to Calaf and says to him, don't look at me like that. You who mock my pride, I shall never be yours, I will not. And no one will ever possess me. Stuff like that. She's threatening Calaf that, no, you won't do this to me. But she knows that she is at every disadvantage. That's why she has to give a last-ditch attempt to, threaten Calaf while, convincing her father to change his mind. And what she has to sound like is imposing and grand and desperate at the same time, which is very difficult to do, and this is what she does. And now, her famous, Turandot's famous high Cs, 2 of them blasted over the orchestra, over the chorus. You have to hear the desperate quality in their voice while, delivering 2 earth-shattering, ringing high Cs. thing is, if you are singing Turandot and you can't have these two high Cs heard over the chorus and the orchestra, you probably shouldn't be doing the role, to be honest. And this is where you see if the Turandot A has the high notes to sing the role, B has the volume to sing the role, C has the emotional capacity and the nuance to sing the role. And then Calaf, of course, responds with his famous "No, no, Principessa Altera," "No, no, Grand Princess, I want you full with love." And very, very impressive statement, right? It has to be very confident, and that's why you don't want just, any statement. You want this phrase sung with actual confidence and with an actual handsome striking quality that eventually convinces, Turandot to fall for him. And Barioni, with a very sharp-edged voice, and you can hear the confidence in his voice while singing this phrase, and this is what he does. Like, this is the kind of confidence that you have to have in order to, say that I want you filled with love. You can't just say that if you don't have the confidence and the strictness, and you have to have the sharp edge, the amazing C, and all of that. Of course, you can't. You can omit the C. I mean, it isn't written, but yeah, you have to have that in order to impress Turandot, and that's what Barioni does. And actually, I'll talk about something here. Whether or not to interpolate this particular C at "No, Principessa Altera." The thing is, I don't actually agree with this interpolation. I usually, allow all interpolations, but there's a reason to this. And I'll play you this, and the reason I know that, because I'm from Hong Kong, I'm Chinese, and I've grown up listening to this traditional song called "茉莉花," and I'll play the melody of this to you, and you'll understand why I don't agree with the interpolation. It's a direct quotation, and some, I don't know who, just went and altered the entire melody. That's why I grew up listening to this song, and I discovered opera. Oh wow, I know this, but they just go and change the entire vocal line. That's why I'm always a bit questionable about this particular interpolation, but I want it to happen, although it's not musically ethical to do that. But I always want to hear a high C, don't you? Exactly. And after that, Calaf has to, it's not enough to convince Turandot, and he comes up with the counteroffer. "You ask me 3 riddles, and I will solve all 3. I will propose only one to you. You do not know my name. Tell me my name before dawn, and at dawn I will die." Of course, he has to come in with assertion, because you said no one would solve these riddles, and I've gone and done it, and that's why "Tre enigmi mai proposto e tre mischiolsi" has to be sung with that kind of solidness in the voice, that kind of assertion and dominance. And then here comes the immediate change of tone, because it's a very beautiful melody, and you have to, sing that, and at dawn I will die. Calaf is willing to sacrifice himself to prove his love for Turandot. And that's why this has to be sung almost mezza voce, or at least you have to have a very tender tone. And that's why Calaf is not just blasting through the role with such confidence, such strikingness, like a reckless young boy. No, you have to have the kind of moving quality, which you have to have in Non Piangere Liu, the first aria, which I didn't put here because it isn't, what the entire role of Calaf is about, but Non Piangere Liu, as well as Il mio nome non sai, has to be sung with some of the most tender, most moving, and most emotional tones that one can have. You need to hear the tear in the voice, and here's where Corelli comes in. I mean, if you can nail this phrase, it pretty much means that your Act 1 with the Non Piangere Liu and whatnot is in safe hands, because you can sing with, a lot of emotion. If you can nail the high C before that, it basically means that you have the high notes for this role, for, Nessun Dorma, for the riddle scene, for the final duet, you have that imposing, striking voice. And that's why these, few lines from Nonna Principessa to Il mio nome non sai is what I would look out for if you were to hear, whether a Calaf does well or not. That's basically most Turandot, but we still have Liu, the innocent and faithful servant. And while her, big scene is at Act 3, I think what truly defines a good performance of Liu is her Act 1 aria, Signore Ascolta, because there is a balance between the imploring, the desperate quality of trying to not get Calaf do some stupid shit. You have to balance between that and the innocent, the pure quality of the voice. So purity and desperation, you have to find a balance between that, and that's why it's difficult to do so. And this is where Liu, at the very last lines, you hear the purity of the voice, you hear the innocence on that high B flat, started pianissimo, and then it crescendos into a forte, which, is the balance between the purity of the pianissimo and the desperation in the forte. And you hear Anamorpho, which is what I played, do the chest voice on Liu non regge più, which is, another sign of the desperation. while I find the crescendo effective in providing, the dramatic context, I actually kind of like Caballet's keeping it pianissimo all throughout, or you can go for something like Stitch Randall it, which I'm going to play it now. Yeah, so it's a very difficult B flat to pull off in order to, convey Liu's lyricism and dramaticism. And you could take it many ways, but you have to make sure that you get the message across to the listener. Then we come to the role of Timur, a bass that has to be, a basso cantante with a deep and dark enough voice to, convey the character of the father, the desperate father. I've chosen his little monologue after Liu's death, which is Liu Soraji, and it's not terribly hard to sing, but it's hard to get across the emotions, because well, Liu just died, and Timur, being the old man, doesn't know what's happened, and she's singing, Liu, get up, it's the bright hour for all awakening, it's the dawn, my Liu, open your eyes, my dove. And then Ping comes in and says that get up, she's dead, and Timur is like, horrible crime, we will all pay for it, the offended spirits will take revenge. So before and after Ping's line of telling him that she's dead, you have to hear two different vocalisms. The first one being a tender, dark, deep, and sonorous basso cantante kind of beautiful timbre. And after Ping tells him she's dead, and after Ping's line, he has to sing large, with that imposing quality, because we will all pay for the horrible crime. The offended will take revenge. Si vendicherà delitto orrendo. All of that. So you have to hear two different vocalisms, and here is Luciano Neroni doing it. So yeah, you have to hear the two different tones, and that's pretty much what a Timur should be doing. He should be able to do both characters, so to speak. And I just realized, quite incredibly, James Morris has recorded Turandot in 1974, recorded Timur across Franco Corelli as Calaf. He's also recorded in 2021 with Yusuf Avazov as Calaf. How things have changed. So, I think we can get into our recordings. Obviously, we'll start, as usual, with the good and commercially available recordings. The first one we have with us is quite the famous recording, actually. It's from 1938, conducted by Franco Ghione, which is the first complete recording of this opera, with the orchestra of the EIA Torino, Gina Signa is Turandot, Francesco Merli is Calaf, a very young Magda Olivero, before her very long hiatus, is Liu here. Luciano Neroni is Timur, and Afropoli is Ping. What do I think about this recording? Of course, it's a legendary recording. It really showcases, the style of Puccinian singing in the 30s, 40s, more similar to, a Verdian style. This was only 12 years after the premiere, so it's probably what an authentic voice would have sounded like at the premiere. We don't know how Rosa Raiza sounded like as Turandot. We don't know how Fleta sounded like as Calaf, although we do have Maria Zamboni singing Liuzak Manzaria. But this is perhaps the closest we can get to a recording of the premiere. Gina Signa as Turandot. What I think about Signa is, obviously she's a massive voice, a really typical early Italian dramatic soprano, I would say. As Turandot, I honestly think that she is, of course it's a massive voice, but I almost find it too straightforward. But putting that aside, it's obviously a Italian voice, a very dramatic, very red hot voice that, well, it suits the vocalisms of the role of Turandot. It suits the kind of voice that, is suitable for singing this role. But the interpretation is something that, we kind of won. Because Rosa Raiza, in the premiere, we have, her recordings and stuff like Trovatore and other Verdi stuff. And you can hear that it's a very nuanced voice, a very gentle one. Possessing, of course, the same Italianate quality as Signa, but it's not as straightforward and, as rough, I would say, as Signa. Signa with her, a bit of a caprino, it is imposing. The imposingness of the voice is there, of course, but it just doesn't convince you enough that is a Turandot with, many shades of nuance, a very mysterious Oriental princess. We don't really get that, and the same could be said for Birgit Nilsson, which I will go into later, but this is Signa now. Francesco Merli as Calaf, well, undoubtedly a great, great, great tenor. But the thing with his Calaf here, he sings the kind of nuanced emotional passages. He sings that with a lot of detail, with a lot of care. You can almost hear the tear in his voice, and I really really appreciate that, especially his Non piangere Liu and stuff like Il mio nome non sai. However, for the parts which are more straightforward, like the riddle scene, the final duets, something like Nono Principessa, what I think about that is it's a very sharp-edged voice, and almost too sharp-edged that it doesn't sound like a striking, handsome prince who is here to, get Turandot. It just sounds a bit too forced and too rough at the edge for me. But that's just limited to these kind of straightforward parts. When the part requires nuance, the nuance is definitely there. Magda Olivero as Liu. Well, of course, we all know that Olivero is a figure who is either extremely popular or extremely unpopular. And here, 1938, and before her, hiatus of about, I don't know, 15 years, we can still hear what her voice actually sounds like. But here, when she was 28, I really can't say I'm hearing anything except for her vibrato, and it really, really, flips me off because, it's a beautiful instrument, but what I'm hearing is just vibrations. It's just a caprino. Is all I'm hearing, and that's why I'm not a fan of this particular recording of the role. But the rest of the cast is very nicely sung as well. Luciano Neroni, a very big, a very warm voice as Timur, which is what we want, and Afropoli is a very interesting and very striking minister taking the role of Pink. Then we come to our next recording, which is from 1953, conducted by Alberto Herrera with the orchestra and chorus of Santa Cecilia. Ingeborg is Turandot, Mario del Monaco, Calaf. Liu is Renata Tebaldi, Timur Nicola Zaccaria, and the three ministers are Fernando Carrena, Mario Carlin, and Renato Ercolani. Let's talk about Ingeborg's Turandot. Borg, in 1953, was a very, very interesting voice because prior to 1951, she had a completely different set of technique, a completely different vocalism that you can hear on her live Salome with Kielbert from 1951. Here, 53, she takes on a completely different technique. She covers all she sings, but this leads to a very, very interesting quality of the voice, which is almost, it's a very sensitive voice. It almost has a kind of, nervous quality to it, a very paranoid quality to it, but it provides a very interesting, interpretation of the role of Turandot, because basically Turandot is this princess who is traumatized by her ancestors' experience, and you can hear the trauma in her voice. You can definitely do that in Turandot. It's not a massive voice, but that vocalism is enough to make a very, very convincing portrayal of the role. And her high notes are there, all of that is there, and a very impressive Turandot. Mario Delmonico as Calaf. I never thought that. I've never considered this Turandot his greatest recording. Of course, Delmonico is a tenor that I absolutely, absolutely adore. You should know that. But this Calaf is a bit underwhelming for me because, for the most part, he's yelling, to be honest. He's just belting the roll out, which, of course, is fine. I would rather have Delmonico belt the roll out than some lyric tenor completely drowned by the orchestra. But uh, it's just not convincing enough for a role like Calaf, who is so nuanced. Of course, you can just belt out the riddle scene, you can belt out your replies to Turandot, but you can't do that with Nessun Dorma, you can't do that with Non Piangere Liu. All the nuances there, and the Monaco, just a bit lackluster on that. Tebaldi as Liu, well, we have two recordings of her Liu, one from 53, one from 60, the next one I'm going to talk about. And this one, what would I say? This one is a bit, early Tebaldi, the more raw vocalisms. It's not as nuanced, it's not as, softly spun out, and it doesn't remind me really of, a very innocent servant, a young girl servant. It doesn't remind me of that. But you cannot deny that her lyricism there, the voice per se, is incredible, And in the role of Liu, it doesn't get better than that. Nicola Zaccaria as Timur, he will be on many, many, many recordings on this video as Timur. And let's just say that he's a very sonorous bass, a deep and booming one, who has, a kind of emotional quality to it. But it falls short in, emotional convincingness in such a emotional role like Timur. It falls short of, Tozzi or whatever other truly basso cantante, and Zaccaria is just a bit too sharp-edged for my liking. But Erede conducts fantastically, and this whole recording, it's worth it because of Borg. Tebaldi and Delmonico, of course, are great as well. Just not, the most idiomatic voices for these two roles. Then we have a very, very interesting recording from 1957, again in studio, conducted by Tullio Serafin with the orchestra and chorus of La Scala. Here we have Maria Callas, only complete recording as Turandot, with Eugenio Fernandez Calaf, Elizabeth Schwarzkopf as Liu, and Nicola Zaccaria as again Timur, the Emperor Altome is Giuseppe Nessi, and the three ministers are Mario Bariello, Renato Ercolani again, and Piero de Palma. So, Carlos Turandot. We all know about the 1949 Buenos Aires Turandot excerpts with Mario de Monaco. Only 2 minutes of that is actually, authentic stuff, and the rest of it is just mixed together from the 53 Erede and the 57 Serafin. So only 2 minutes of that is real, the rest is fake. And I'll talk about that 2 minutes later on in the excerpt section. But back to Callas Turandot under Serafin here. The thing is, I think Callas makes a pretty idiomatic Turandot, but her voice is just way, way, way past her prime here. A 1949 full Turandot would be much more convincing because she had the vocalism back then to take on Wagner, to take on, big roles like Gioconda, and Turandot as well. She did quite a few of them. But here, 1957, it's a thinned out voice, a sort of, how should I put it? It's a very nuanced voice. It still has the, Callas sound to it, but it just isn't imposing enough. It's quite thin, but the shrillness of the quality kind of makes people think that Turandot is a very cold and a very cruel woman. That is true, but it just doesn't convey the complete role. It isn't imposing enough when the voice is so thin. However, the interpretation of the role is one of my absolute favorites because Callas, with her interpretations, you can never go wrong. Although the voice is quite wayward here, you can still hear the interpretations, the different nuances that she puts, every single word that Turandot sings, especially from In Questa Regia. Every word, every single word is sung with so much intent, with background. She really studied, how every word should be sung. and there are just so many different shades and so many different nuances to her Turandot that you can't get enough of it, despite the questionable vocal condition. However, the rest of the cast is a bit questionable. Firstly, we have Eugenio Fernandez Calaf. He's a great lyric tenor, yeah, but he is really, really stretching his for this Calaf. It sounds forced. It's shrill at times, and he is just yelling at some points, and I don't like that at all. The high C in Nono Principessa is very, very poorly pasted on by the sound engineers, and all in all, it's just not a Calaf that you want to listen to again. Elizabeth Schwarzkopf as Liu. Again, Schwarzkopf, a very, very controversial singer. What do I think about her Liu? Of course, you have the creamy voice, you have the legato, you have all of that. But what I think about this Liu is that there's this Mozartian seductiveness to it. It does not sound like an innocent servant. It sounds like, some kind of Mozart woman trying to seduce Calaf or whatever. And no, Schwarzkopf, just her interpretation and her voice is just too Mozart for such a beautiful role like Liu, and I don't like it at all. In Zakaria again as Timur, Borriello is a bit undervoiced as Ping, but Ercolani and De Palma as Pang and Pong are well sung. But a very, very honorable mention here is Eji Sepenesi, who is singing Altom. I really like his Emperor, although it's just a few lines, but he really, really sounds great. A very, very characteristic, a very unique Bufo tenor voice. He was in the premiere as Pang, not as the Emperor, but here he sounds fantastic, and you can't pick something wrong out of his Emperor. Now then, we have a 1960 recording in studio again with Eric Leinsdorf conducting. The Teatro dell'Opera di Roma provides the orchestra and the chorus. Turandot is Björgen Nilsson, Jussi Björling is Calaf, Renato De Baldi is Liu again, Mario Sereni, Piero De Palma, and Tommaso Frascati are the three ministers. Giorgio Tozzi is Timur, and Alessio De Paulis is Altom. Nilsson's Turandot. We have to get to this sooner or later, don't we? Let's just say this. She debuted the role in 1958 and sung it right up until, the 1970s. The way her Turandot progressed from 1958 to the 70s. Let's say this. In 1958, her Turandot was, very nuanced. There was a lot of chest voice. There was a lot of, darkness of the voice. It really sounded, like a mysterious voice. It is a creepy voice, and not just what we usually associate with Nilsson's Turandot, just blasting it all out. That wasn't the case in 1958. Although, I must say that this studio recording in 1960 is not Nilsson at her best, because she didn't work well under studio conditions. She had to tune things down a bit here, and while you don't get the blasting of her voice, you also don't get too much of the darkness, the mysteriousness, and the nuance of her voice here. So this is far from her best, and that's because it's in studio. However, as she progressed, there are further recordings in 1961, 64, 65, through to 1970, and beyond that, but I won't talk about those after that because I don't have most of them. As she progressed, she reached her peak singing this role in 1964 and 65, where she really blasted it all out while keeping some nuance. And after that, it's just a declining vocalism and increasingly covered voice, which isn't necessarily pleasant here. But this particular recording, 1960, her second complete Turandot, and Jussi Björling is Calaf. Now, well, we know that he died in 1960, so this was very, very, at the very end of his career. But his Calaf here, you don't associate, Björling with a heroic voice. He definitely isn't a heroic Calaf type of voice. But this is in studio, and it works towards his favor. His Nessun Dorma is okay. It's rousing, but what really, strikes my heart is not the more heroic parts, of course. It's not the riddle scene. Instead, it's the At One Non Piangere Liu. It's an amazing recording, a really amazing recording of this aria, because you can hear a very benevolent voice, a Calaf, a master that really cares for her servant, his servant Liu, and you can hear the kind of pained voice. in this aria you can hear his struggle between, sacrificing his freedom for Liu, or getting to Randot, and all of that. You can hear the internal struggle, and it's a really, really amazing voice. And Leinsdorf conducts the Act 1 finale exceptionally well. All in all, it's just a very, very good conclusion to Act 1, with Björling and of course Tebaldi singing her aria preceding that. As I've said, uh, she might sound a bit, older, more matured here in the voice, but her interpretation of the role is much more nuanced, much more gentle, and much more virgin-like, as you would say, much more like an innocent servant that Liu is. Giorgio Tozzi as Timur, that's what a beautiful basso cantante should sound like. Giorgio Tozzi, always one of my favorite baritones, and I mean basses, and his Timur is his quite exceptional, very emotional singing. Mario Sereni as being a very, very interesting, trio of ministers as well. Which brings us to our last of this commercial recording section. It's the 1965 recording with Francesco Molinari Pradelli, with the orchestra and chorus of, again, the Rome Opera. Nilsson is again Turandot, but Calaf, this time is Franco Corelli. Renata Scotto as Liu. Bonaldo Giaiotti sings Timur. Angelo Mercuriali as the Emperor. And the three ministers are Guido Mazzini, Franco Ricciardi, and Piero de Palma. This, of course, is a very, very famous recording because it's the only studio or commercial recording with Nilsson and Corelli together. There are tons of live ones, tons of them together, which, honestly, most of them are much better than this one. I'll explain later, but let's just talk about, Corelli and his Calaf first. Again, same as Nilsson, his first complete Calaf was in 1958. In the movie, of course, I'll talk about that later. And in that 58 recording, he was really, fresh, really striking voice, a really confident and a very, striking, a very handsome Calaf that you would portray the character is as in Nessun Dorma and the riddle scene, very self-confident in winning over their princess. However, shortly after, from 1960 onwards, he retained the kind of confidence in the end of Act 2 and Act 3, but he also, developed a kind of dark voice, a kind of emotional portrayal in the Act 1 finale, and all of his internal struggles that we don't have in the 58 recording. They started coming out in 1960, and the one recording in 1960, a live one, which I'll talk about later, is, I consider, his best Calaf, because you have the balance between the emotional aspects of the Act 1 and the more striking and confident aspects of Acts 2 and 3. However, from 1965 onwards, his voice started to loosen, and it developed, a more tear-like quality to it, which is why, in 1966, from the Metropolitan, is my favorite Non Piangere Liu, because it's the most emotional, the most tear-like, and most heartfelt Non Piangere Liu that I've ever heard, and that's from 1966. But for the rest of the opera, he is in rather questionable form, with the loosened voice, even if he can hit the high Cs and the high Bs with immaculate quality. It just doesn't sound like a young prince that is so full and confident of himself, and that is no longer the case in the 66 recording. Back to this, in 65, in studio, both Nilsson and Corelli peaked shortly before that in their respective roles. So this was, I would say, the start of their gradual decline in these two roles respectively, and the studio conditions don't work for these two of them. It's cold. It doesn't have the exciting, red hot, the electrifying quality that you have on the live recordings with these two in their respective roles. It's the electrifying, exciting quality that makes these duo the most famous in their respective roles, and you don't get that in studio. You simply can't capture the kind of electricity between these two in studio. You can't. And Scotto as Liu, again, very good legato, very beautiful voice. She pulls off impressive pianissimi here, but it's just that her voice has a unpleasant kind of metal-y quality to it, which, eventually detrimented her reputation and her quality and all that stuff. And it's an average Liu at best because of that. Giaiotti as Timur, we have his live Timurs from the Metropolitan, which are deep, dark, and booming. But for some reason here in studio, he lightens his voice, and I don't know why he would do that, but it's just not as impressive as his live Timurs, honestly. And Molinari Pradelli is just average. So all things considered, forego this studio recording. It's great, of course it's great. There's Corelli and Nilsson and Giaiotti and Scotto and whatnot, but it's just not as good as the live recordings with these two. Now we're going into the category of good live recordings. Obviously, there's a lot of them, but 99% of those have either Nilsson or Corelli or both. And that's why usually we have 5 inclusions for this category. This time we still have 5, but the first 3 will be recordings with Nilsson and Corelli, recordings with Nilsson alone, and recordings with Corelli alone. Then I have 2 other good live recordings, but here's what I have. For Nilsson and Corelli together, I've chosen 4 recordings, Nilsson alone 5, and Corelli alone 5. All of these live recordings, of course. And we'll, put them on a scale, put them on a comparison to see how these 2 artists grew into their roles, or how the interpretation changed of these 2 roles over time. So of course we start with Nilsson and Corelli, which are live recordings with both of them in the cast. There are a lot of them, with the studio recording that I've mentioned also, and there are other ones most of which I can't find, but there are a lot of them recorded. I have 4 of these with Nilsson and Corelli together. First one is from 1961 at the Met, and Leopold Stokowski conducts. Anamorpho is Liu, Frank Guerrera Ping, Nagi and Anthony are Pang and Pong, and Bonaldo Giaiotti is again Timur. Then we go to a recording from 1964. This is at La Scala, conducted by Gianandrea Gavazzeni. Liu here is Galina Wisniewskaja, Renato Capecci is Ping, and Nicola Zaccaria is Timur. Then we have one from 1966. Again, this is from the Metropolitan. Zubin Mehta is conducting. Mirella Freni is Liu this time, and Theodor Upman sings Ping. Bonaldo Giaiotti is again Timur. For the last one we have, it is from 1970. I don't have the complete opera, but the role of Calaf is full here. It's uploaded by the channel Afropoli. It has Antonio Zerbini as Timur. Liu is Antonietta Canarile Berdini, and Franco Manino is conducting. It's at the Macerata Opera Festival, 1970 again. And out of these 4 recordings, in comparison to the 65 studio, here's what I'll say about Nilsson and Corelli in their respective roles. There's a curve, of the interpretation of the roles and, their vocalisms, all of that. It's starting from 1958 to the 1970s. We'll juxtapose them and see what we have. So here, the first one we have is 1961. Nilsson, in 1961, still kept a dark vocalism. There was not a lot of, covering, as she did later on in her career, but there was still a very dark core there. And there's more of this mysterious veil to the character of Turandot, as opposed to, from the mid-60s onwards, it was more direct, more of blasting and the cruelty, and more covering, more coordinated chest voice, all of that. Here, in 1961, Nilsson was a very dark voice, a very interpretive, and a very mysterious princess. Corelli here in 1961 is still having, a fresh voice, but his best Calafs were the ones in 1960, which I will talk about later in the Corelli only section. Here, 1961, there's still the freshness in the voice, which started to lose from the studio recording 65 onwards. But apart from, the freshness of the voice, there wasn't a caprino as there was in, the 1958 film one, and the darkness of the voice is still there. However, we start to hear a bit of, a sad kind of plaintive Calaf, as we would hear in, this 1966 Met onwards. The Calaf, especially the first aria, Non piangere Liu, starts to get, actually emotional. He starts to put himself into, you know, the suffering of the character of Khalaf, which we do not get much in the 58 film recording. So this 61, I would say, still retains that freshness of voice, but at the same time it has, you know, an emotional tint to it. However, the voice itself is not as, you know, fearless, absolutely ringing high notes. It's just barely not as good as the 60, which I will talk about later. For the rest of the cast in this 61 recording, we have Ronaldo Giaiotti. Here live he is significantly darker than the 65 studio recording. It's just the recording equipment, the vocals doesn't capture his voice well, and live it does. It's a very rich and very dark voice. But Anna Moffo as Liu, now that is something incredible. I don't think there has been, you know, a better Liu than Anna Moffo, save Montserrat Caballé, because Moffo's voice here, it has the innocent, you know, servant facade to her Liu, but there's also an attractiveness to it. It's the beauty of the voice, the velvety flowing legato, exquisite pianissimi, and it's not just, you know, thin and you know, kind of silky like Caballé's Liu. This one is actually creamy in quality, and it is a very, very, very indescribable experience listening to Anna Moffo's Liu. And you've got to listen to it. Leopold Stokowski here conducts with questionable tempi, but he's still a great conductor. Just sometimes he drags things way too slow, in this recording particularly. But all things considered, Nilsson with her last mysterious Turandot, Corelli with his first emotional Turandot, I would say so, and Moffo with one of the best Lius you'll ever hear, all in this 1961 recording live at the Met. Now we come to talk about the 1964 recording. It has Gavazzeni on the podium, Nilsson here, and Corelli. What I would say is the 64 at Scala is the most balanced, I would say, out of the two extremes for both of them. For Nilsson, the two extremes were dark and mysterious, fierce and covered. For Corelli, the two extremes were fresh and fearless, emotional and plaintive. This 64 is at the middle of, you know, both of their respective extremes, I would say, and it's much better than the 65 studio, if I do say so myself, because studio recording just doesn't capture the excitement that Corelli and Nilsson puts on stage. Nilsson first, shall we? Here, 1964. She starts to do quite a bit of covering, you know. She pushes her coordinated chest voice up and up. There's less of, you know, a dark, mysterious princess, more so an insatiable, spoiled princess, I would say, because that is what the covering does to her voice and her vocalisms. But that gives us the high notes that blast out of her throat. Here in 1964, she absolutely blasts those high notes out from her throat like a laser beam. By 66, her voice was starting to decline. It was a bit weak at the high notes. They sounded a bit strained. And before that, before the 64, the high notes were still absolutely incredible. They were still laser beams. But there just isn't that sense that it's all about those high notes. Here in 64, it is all about those high notes, because before that she put on a lot of, you know, interpretation. Here you take those high notes for granted because she displays a spoiled princess, and all she does is blast high notes and beheads princes. And that's what I take away from Nilsson's Turandot in 1964. Although her best in terms of, you know, laser beam high notes that pin you to the wall are the excerpts in Moscow, again under Gavazzeni, 3 months before this, on tour with La Scala. There, her high notes are at the very, very best. Here it's not bad at all, because it's just 3 months, is the same production. It wouldn't, you know, change a lot, but here she's under the competition of Corelli. Maybe she gets nervous, I don't know. But both of them are at their very, very vocal prime when it comes to, you know, high notes, battling it out with each other. Again, Corelli with a balanced Khalaf. The freshness of the voice is in a little bit of decline here, but the Nessun Dorma, the riddle scene, all of that requires the heroic sound. The sound is still there, which for our next live recording, 1966, we don't hear that much of heroism in there, to be honest. Same with Nilsson from that 66 recording, but here, while retaining the heroism in the 64 recording, I mean, he still has that emotional side to Khalaf. His Non Piangere Liu from 64 is one that truly moves you. It's second only to the 66 Met, which I would also talk about. And here he starts to do the diminuendo on morirà in Il mio nome non sai e l'alba morirà. That's the first time he does it, and it's absolutely incredible how he pulls off that pianissimo, the diminuendo and all of that. It's balanced in a sense where the heroism is still there, but you can really hear that Corelli is taking the emotional side of Khalaf to another level. Vishnevskaya's Liu, La Scala went crazy over her Liu. Personally, I don't understand why. It's good, but it's not that good, in my opinion. Zaccaria, again, a great Moore, Capecci, a great Ping, De Palma and Ricciardi are Pang and Pong, and they're great as well. Mercuriali is a convincing altome, yeah. And then, 1966 at the Metropolitan. Our next recording, this is on the Zubin Meta, Frenias Liu, Giaiotti, Nilsson's Turandot here. This is where her voice starts to get a bit strange, It doesn't sound as fearless as she does in 1964 and to some extent the 1965 studio. She blasts like a spoiled princess here. She still does in 1966, but it's a bit weak. Not very weak. This vocalism is still there. It's very strong. All of that is there. But in comparison to 1964, it's just a bit tired, her voice. And you would expect that after singing 8 years of non-stop Turandots, wouldn't you? That's it about Nilsson. The interpretation hasn't changed much. Just that her voice was starting to get a bit tired in the role of Turandot from 66 onwards. Corelli as Khalaf. This 66 recording, the Non Piangere Liu from this Turandot, is truly the very, very, very best version of this aria ever sung. And I'm not even exaggerating. The B flat there, absolutely, absolutely heartbreaking. You can hear the tears in his voice, and this is by far his most emotional Khalaf. Because I would presume that in this 66 recording, his riddle scene, his Nessun Dorma, is not as virile, is not as heroic as he could do in 1964, and more so before that. 58, 60, those are purely heroic. 64, I said there's a balance between the two, but 66, his virility started to decrease, and he solely focused the role of Khalaf on its emotional side, and that's why his Non Piangere Liu from this 66 recording is undoubtedly the best version of the aria ever recorded. But the rest of the recording, the rest of the role, he does the Il mio nome non sai beautifully, but the virility again is just not as striking, as imposing as Khalaf as the earlier recordings, especially in 1960, which I would talk about. But still a recording that is definitely worth listening to, just for the Non Piangere Liu. Mirella Frenia's Liu here, much better than her studio recording. You can hear, a beautifully transparent voice without, any sort of seductiveness about it. It's, a young girl, a young servant, absolutely innocent, transparent voice, and her Liu here is extraordinary as well, just not as, memorable as Motho's. Giaiotti as Simur here hasn't changed much, I would say. Zubin Meta here is an absolute revelation. He's only 30 here, and only, a few months ago did he make his Metropolitan debut. But he conducts absolutely fantastic here. The brassiness of the sound is there. The emotional side, the more lush and more plaintive side of the orchestra is there. It's a fantastically conducted Turandot, and overall it's just a great recording for its emotional intensity. For the last one we have is 1970 Macerata, although we don't have the full opera here. we can see how this is, the accumulation of the battle between the rivalry between Corelli and Nilsson in these two roles. All of us know about, their stories about, holding the high C longer than one another. When Nilsson doesn't hold it as long as Corelli, she'd get pissed and all that. Rudolf Bing told her to bite Corelli instead of kissing her at the final scene. All of those stories here in 1970. It's, accumulation of that, with, Afropoli the channel. His description of this is basically, well, let's just say that neither Corelli or Nilsson are in very good vocal form here. Both of them know that, but they're going to give it all out anyway, because this is at Macerata, this is Corelli's home turf, and it's open air and all of that, so they're going to blast it all out nonetheless. Their voices do sound tired, but you can hear the excitement in that. You can hear the competitiveness in both of their interpretations. You can hear how they're dueling one another. So they just go all in. All the rubati are taken at the extreme. The high notes are held ridiculously long, sung full voice. There's no restraint at all, and it's not, the most idiomatic reading of the role you'll ever get, but they're just dueling. They're just doing it for fun, and it makes the crowd go crazy, and that's what matters in this kind of old school opera. The conductor is just a spectator. Corelli and Nilsson are putting on their show, and he's just looking onwards. Canarile Bardini is a nice liu. Antonio Zerbini is a great tenor, a dark voice, a big voice, but it's all about Corelli and Nilsson. The high C at the end of In Questa Regia, it's held ridiculously long. It's like 7 seconds or something like that, and it's just an all-out battle. The final duet, again, they just go all out. They know that they're gonna battle it to the death, and that's what they do. It's Corelli's home turf, and absolutely, they're just showing off. And this is not what you would want if you want to listen to Turandot, but this is what you want if you want to listen to Nilsson, you want to listen to Corelli, or if you want an exciting experience. And it's absolutely unmissable, this 70 Macerata recording. Then these are recordings with Nilsson alone in the title role, with various collabs, but all of these are live recordings. I have 5 here. The first one is from 1958 at La Scala. This is her role debut. Giuseppe Di Stefano's collab, Rosanna Carteri is liu, Capecci is Ping, Giuseppe Modesti is Timur, and Mercuriali is Altom. The next one is from 1961, and it is from the Vienna Staatsoper. It has Francesco Molinari Pradelli conducting. Giuseppe Di Stefano is again Calaf. Leonton Price, however, is liu this time, and Costas Pakalis, Ermanno Lorenzi, and Murray Dickey are the 3 ministers. Nicola Zaccaria is Timur Peter Klein Altom, and the Mandarin is Alois Pernersdorfer, an all-star cast this. Then we have one from 1965. This is from Buenos Aires, from the Teatro Colón. It has Dimitar Uzunov as Calaf, Montserrat Caballé is absolutely beautiful liu here, and Victor Denarque is Timur. For our next one, it is from 1969, and this one is from the Arena di Verona. Placido Domingo here is Calaf, Gabriele Tucci is liu, Molinari Pradelli again conducts, and Ivo Vinco is Timur. And the last one we have here is from 1970 again, but this time it is from the Metropolitan with Domingo again as Calaf, but it has Lucina Mara this time in the role of liu, and Giaiotti as Timur as usual at the Met. Again, placing these 5 performances on the Nilsson Turandot curve, which I'll call it, you can hear that in her role debut in 1958. It's a completely different Turandot than what you get in 1970, yeah? 58 at La Scala, her role debut, absolutely fantastic Turandot. You hear that, I've said that, in 1964, the high notes were fearless and, pin you to the wall. Here in 58, they're not as, fearless in the sense of, the attack, but the voice is still as large. It's still as, laser beam, like it's still as sharp-edged, and it definitely, it permeates La Scala. The walls are shaking. All of that is happening right now because Nilsson just made her mark in the role of Turandot 30 years after its premiere, as the only Turandot there will ever be, because she's blasting it at full voice while here in 58 singing a very dark and very veiled, very mysterious princess, and an oriental princess, which is, in my opinion, what a Turandot should actually be. It shouldn't be just a spoiled princess killing princes. If that were the case, why would she appeal to those foreign princes anyway? Here in 58, it's a completely different interpretation. It's dark. The chest voice she uses here, not coordinated chest voice that she uses later. That's basically just making it sound more covered and nasal in the middle voice. Here, she actually uses chest voice in the lower notes, and it's a very dark singing, much more so than in 1961, both the studio recording and the live one with Corelli. It is quite the experience, quite honestly. She absolutely destroys Di Stefano on the high C in Questa Regia, and the two high Cs before the Nono Principessa that Nilsson sings. I'm surprised that La Scala didn't even collapse after that. So it may not be as attack-minded, it may not be as, pew, right at you, as the 1964 Moscow one, but here, her high notes are just massive. Like a nuclear explosion happening inside the house, because those high notes just permeate the entire house, as opposed to, like a laser beam or a bullet shooting at you in a 1964 Moscow. And that's what I think anyway. But you can't deny that this 55 Turandot debut is, it's her best Turandot in my opinion. It's just that the high notes is what makes me feel, oh wow. Yeah, but this 55 debut, definitely her best Turandot, in my opinion at least. Well, the rest of the cast, Di Stefano, just miscast as Khalaf. He sounds tired. He just doesn't sound like he should be singing any of the role. His non-piangere Liu, this should, appeal to his lyricism of the voice, but no, it's strained, it's tired, and it doesn't have, the effect. It isn't, a lyrical, moving reading. There isn't this kind of Di Stefano lyricism in it, just because the role is too heavy for him, and he has to strain his voice in order to sing it. So it doesn't have a great effect at all. His nice and dorma, again, is strained. But what I do appreciate of his Khalaf is his Il mio nome non sai, because the diminuendo on Morira, the same as Corelli in 64, absolutely beautiful. But that's probably just the 60 seconds out of the hour-long role of Khalaf that I like about Di Stefano's Khalaf. Rosanna Kateri as Liu, very Verismo singer, but a bit too Verismo in the sense of it being very outward and very hysterical, but that isn't Liu. Liu is a kind of introverted, pure-hearted girl, and Carteri is just a bit too, Verismo for that, in my opinion at least. And Modesty here is Timur, great, dark, and deep voice. It's moving, and it's good. Antonino Votto, great as usual. The big sounds are all there, and great recording of the opera. In 1961, on next recording, it isn't that different from the Metropolitan one 2 months earlier, but she's doing very great voice here. The covering is there, and the dark voice, the kind of mysterious approach to the role of Turandot is definitely present under the baton of Francesco Molinari Pradelli. I would say it's less inspiring than Stokowski conducting. Giuseppe Di Stefano, just about the same interpretation as Khalaf as 3 years prior, and still struggles from the same things. However, Leonton Price as Liu is the revelation here. Most of you might know that I'm not the biggest fan of Price, although I really like her in some Puccini repertoire. I've said that her Tosca was not most idiomatic because her voice kind of lacked the regality of the role, right? Here as Liu, her voice has the right quality for the character because it has the kind of translucent type of voice, a very refined and very gentle interpretation of the role. But also, she has the earthiness in her voice, which is what most Lius are lacking in, because, well, she's Kalaf's servant, Timur's servant. It has that earthiness to the voice, which we don't often hear in other Lius, and that's why I love her Liu. I love her Georgetta in Tabaro as well, which I would cover later. But here, her Liu is really, really well sung, and the nuances are all there. It's one of my favorite recordings of hers, to be honest. And Nilsson here and Price coming together. Also, a very, very strong cast in the ministers, with Pascalis as being Lorenzi and Dicky as Pang and Pong, respectively. Zakaria is the great Timur, as usual. Peter Klein, a great alto, and Alois Parnestor, a bit of, very great casting as the Mandarin. Then we have a recording from 1965. This is from Teatro Colón, with Uzunov and Caballé. Here, and Nilsson in 1965, I've said that her best, not her best, her most balanced Turandot was in 1964. This is just, a year past that, most balanced recording, and it's the same year as the studio recording. However, here you can really hear that Nilsson has started to go for the more unrestrained route, a bit less nuanced, but a bit more, of a spoiled character, so to speak. Her voice here does not suffer from the same, vocal problems, more of a weaker voice as she does in the 66 minute broadcast. But here you can hear, what her interpretation of the spoiled princess sounds like, although I'm not the biggest fan of that. But it's an interesting document nonetheless because of Montserrat Caballé as Liu. Now, when we talk about, the role of Liu, most of us would think about, Caballé's 72 studio recording with Meta, which I will talk about later, although in the category of recordings to avoid. However, Montserrat Caballé's Liu is absolutely, absolutely fantastic. It's stunning. Because, quite frankly put, the role of Liu requires a kind of silky spun voice. Although her voice is kind of on the thin side, you can really hear the nuances. The pianissimi are done immaculately. It does not have the creamy mofo kind of sound. But Caballé as Liu here, it's a different interpretation of Liu, and one that I love as much as Mofo's Liu. And it's really worth it. Nilsson and Caballé, when they, sing the dialogues, you can really hear the contrast between the two voices. And Caballé, to some extent, brought out the lyricism in Nilsson's voice, whereas, Mofo wouldn't kind of bring out Nilsson and her pianissimi, her kind of smaller, more refined type of voice. Caballé does that here. And, she sang Sieglinde with Nilsson as Brunhilde. Needless to say, that was a mistake for Caballé. But here, Liu, Caballé, and Nilsson, absolutely brilliant. Uzunov as Kalaf, a very virile voice, of course, but, he has quite the wobble, as we all know, and some pitch problems, which makes his Kalaf a little bit less enjoyable, because he just goes all out with his heroism. But the big, kind of wobbly voice reminds me of Bernd Aldenhoff. It just doesn't bring out the pensive side of the character of Kalaf, does it? Yeah. And Victor Denarque as Timur, decent bass with not the biggest voice, but still a very dark and warm interpretation. All in all, Nilsson and Caballé, when they sing together, it's a miracle, and this is what it is. Then we have a 1969 recording at the Arena di Verona. Domingo and Tucci and Vinco are the other lead roles here. Let's just say that by 1969, her Turandot wasn't either vocally secure, nor was it very nuanced. But because of that, she just has to blast it all out, and it's the most raw and, unconcealed version of her Turandot. Obviously, she does quite a bit of covering here, pushing her coordinate chest voice upwards, and it sounds a bit, acidic and nasal in quality. But it still kind of fits the role of Turandot, as I've mentioned, the kind of spoiled quality of the princess. Not my favorite, but it works, yeah, it works. Placido Domingo here as Kalaf. We know, Kalaf, Domingo, the the relation of Domingo to the role of Kalaf is something that most non-operatic people would think, oh, Domingo, famous tenor, Calaf, famous role, they must go together. And those who really get into opera go like, no, Domingo, without top, without high notes, Calaf, a disaster. But it's not. It's decent, I would say. His high Cs here are there. It matches Nilsson on the In Questa Regia, which, not many people can do. Corelli does it. And I can't, think of many tenors who can match Nilsson in the high C. Domingo does it though, and it's a great interpretation of the role. Generally speaking, he does not have the virility of Corelli in the riddle scene, in Nessun Dorma, all of that. It sounds a bit more emotional, a bit more pitiable, I would say. Because of that, his Non Piangere Liu is excellent. It's very, very emotional singing, and you can really hear the kind of poignant side of his voice come out, and it's a very, very moving Non Piangere Liu. It's the typical Domingo timbre, early Domingo timbre, a lyric timbre which is very moving in nature, and it has the kind of tear-like quality in the voice, which we definitely need for Non Piangere Liu. But for the riddle scene and all of his confrontations with Turandot, it's a bit underpowered because he simply does not have the bicep flexing quality of Corelli, but it's not a bad interpretation per se. And Tucci as Liu, it has, it's not the most refined of voices, it's not the most cabaret-ish kind of silky voice, but it's a transparent voice of quite significant size. Might be a little bit too big for the role of Liu. Reminds you more of an Aida than a innocent servant of sorts. But it's still well sung and it's well interpreted. It has the nuance, it has the lyricism, which reminds me kind of like a bit of Mirella Freni, to be honest. And all things considered, it's a great recording. Just that we're missing about 15 minutes, and the sound quality is not very good, to be honest. But just a few months, less than half a year after that, we have Nilsson and Domingo again together. This is a broadcast from the Metropolitan Opera, 1970, February 1970. Much better sound quality. Nilsson and Domingo aren't, that off from their respective interpretations and vocalisms in the role 6 months earlier. But, both of them are in very great form here. Just the same things I mentioned as the Verona recording. However, Giaiotti here as Timur, a very, very pleasant addition. And Lucina Mara as Liu. I really like her Liu because it's a true lyric soprano voice. It has the kind of attractiveness of Moffo's voice, but not too overblown, as some might suggest in Moffo's voice. The attractiveness is there, the beauty and creaminess of tone is there, but also we get the transparentness and the kind of innocence in Caballet's voice, which is, a glittery, a crystalline voice, so to speak. And Amara, her voice is a perfect balance of the two, and that's why I really like her Liu. She can pull off beautiful pianissimi. Her two big scenes are sung with a lot of nuance, with a lot of careful interpretation, and I really like that. Then we have live recordings with Corelli alone. Again, we have 5 here, spanning from 1960 to 1975. Of course, before that we have the 1958 film, but I'll talk about it in the film category, obviously. Nonetheless, we have here 5 recordings. The first two actually are from 1960. The first one from March of 1960. This is from Monte Carlo, conducted by Alfredo Simonetto. Annie Lune Christensen is Turandot here. Giuditta Mazzoleni as Liu, and Timur is Giovanni Foiani. Then, from the same year, this time from October, we have a recording from Livorno, conducted by Manuel Ferrari. Maria Luisa Nasce is Turandot here. Mafalda Micheluzzi as Liu. And Carlo Scaravelli is Ping here. Antonio Casinelli as Timur. Then we move to a recording from 1962, this time from Napoli, conducted by Oliviero De Fabritis. Lucila Udovic is Turandot. Leila Hencher is Liu. And Joshua Hecht is Timur. The 3 ministers are Renato Cesari, Mario Carlin, and Piero de Palma, respectively. Then we move on to a recording from 1966, this time from Covent Garden. Charles Mackerras is on the podium, Amy Stewart is Turandot, Elizabeth Vaughan is Liu, and David Kelly is Timur. For our last one, we have a recording from 1975, this time from Arena di Verona. Giuseppe Patanè is conducting, Danica Mastilovic is Turandot, Anna Novelli is Liu, and Timur is Gianfranco Casarini. Again, just to remind you of the Corelli Calaf curve, 1958, fresh voice with little emotional quality in it. 1960 still has all of the fresh voice here, but we also hear a bit of emotional involvement in here. We can hear the pity for Liu, which we don't hear a lot in the 1958 recording. From that onwards, in 1964, it's the most balanced one because the emotional intensity is there and the freshness of the voice is there, but none of both are at its very finest. 1966 and onwards, a purely pathetic Calaf, which is emotional in nature and lacking the virility in the riddle scene. Let's start with 1960 March. This is from Monte Carlo again. Corelli is in very, very good form here. Although I would suggest that it is kind of a bit lacking in the emotional intensity in Non Piangere Liu, which is, frankly, my favorite part of Corelli's Calaf. But nonetheless, extremely, extremely arousing, very dark singing in the riddle scene, and a very good Nessun Dorma. Not as good as the one from October, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the Nessun Dorma here is very, very well sung. He got an encore for that. That's what you need. I think that's the only time he did an encore for Nessun Dorma, but he did. And Lund Christensen as Turandot here, very Germanic voice, but it's in the sense that it's big, but at the same time it has a lot of nuance, a lot of covering, and a lot of kind of mysterious quality to it. Reminds me of Ingeborg's Turandot, but this one is a bit more solid vocally. It does not have as much breathiness as I would say in Borg's Turandot. So it's a solid voice, but it has the same kind of a mysterious quality, Germanic quality to her Turandot when we compare it to Borg's. The rest of the cast is decent, but Giovanni Foiani as Timur. We usually think of Foiani as a bass with, a caprino, a weak, middle voice, and all of that. His commentatore, his banco, not something that you would necessarily enjoy listening to. But his Timur here, for some reason, he is in very, very good form here. A very dark and very emotional interpretation of this relatively small role. And hats off to Foiani, but Christensen and Corelli absolutely steal the show here. Corelli in particular, his high Cs, absolutely brilliant, but not as brilliant as the October 1960 recording from Livorno. Here, Corelli is at his very, very best, and I would say without a shadow of a doubt that this is his best Calaf ever recorded. Why is that so? From the very start, Non Piangere Liu, I've said that his 1966 Metropolitan is his best, and that, it got emotional from 65 onwards, right? He focused more on the emotional intensity of the role, and that's why his best non-Piangere Liu was from 1966. But here, in 1960, for some reason, he displays very, very poignant singing in the first act, and quite honestly, his Non Piangere Liu here is not worse than a 66, and because it's very, very dark singing, something that he doesn't really get in, after this and before 66. He kind of lightened his voice to make it more squilloish, to make it more pingy and more virile, just at Turandot. But here in 1960, it's a very dark, a very interpretive interpretation of the role. The emotional intensity is not any worse, and his non-Piangere Liu here is absolutely top-notch. But we move on to the riddle scene. His two high Cs from the riddle scene are absolutely spot on. They are two of the best high Cs I have ever heard sung by a tenor, and Corelli nails them both. He absolutely destroys Nasce on the first one, and in his Nono Principessa, excellent high C, and It's his best Turandot high Cs without a doubt. Here 1960 at Livorno. His Nessun Dorma even better than the March of 1960 at Monte Carlo, where he got an encore. Here, it doesn't sound as, tired, as uninspired as he does at Monte Carlo. He sounds a bit, a bit off. His vibrato is wide and stuff there at Monte Carlo, but here in Livorno, after half a year, there has not been any Nessun Dorma sung with as much vocal virility and as much solidness of the voice. You can really hear the heroicness and the freshness of the voice, which we get in the 1958 film. We have both here, and his B natural at the end, absolutely gloriously sung. It doesn't have the wide vibrato as he would do 6 months earlier. And all of that accumulates in the best Nessun Dorma, I think, sung by Corelli. So Non Piangerio, excellent. Riddle Scene, excellent. Nessun Dorma, excellent. I don't think you can ask for anything more. Maria Luisa Nasci as Turandot, very interesting because she sung Glauce with Carlos in the Bernstein revival at La Scala. You don't think that a Glauce, a coloratura soprano, would come and sing Turandot, but she did, and it's a small voice for sure. It's a loud lyric, but it's a small voice. It does not have the spinto quality to the role to a typical Italian spinto. It's not that, but her Turandot here, the covering and the mysteriousness that she puts on is incredible. I haven't heard many Turandots that can sound as mysterious and as pensive as Nasci does here in her interpretation of the role here at Livorno. Although not a very big voice, but a very, very convincing interpretation of the role of Turandot because of how mysterious she makes the role sound. Mafalda Micheluzzi as Liu, she was Corelli's Netta in the 54 Pagliacci film, which I've talked about in my Pagliacci video. But here Micheluzzi as Liu, not the most refined or most beautiful voice per se, but a great interpretation. The lyricism is there, a very respectable reading of the role of Liu. But Corelli here as Calaf, I mean, it's a historical document. Corelli's best Calaf, and the best Calaf is Corelli. And this is the best interpretation of the role of Calaf ever to be sung or ever to be recorded. And only Corelli could do that. Very, very, very best of Corelli. Then, 1962, at Napoli, Corelli here as Calaf, he isn't having his best day here. But he still has, the virility of the sound, a bit lacking in the freshness, the youngness of the voice, so to speak. But the heroicness and the ping, the squillo of the voice isn't at all lacking here. And although it sounds a bit off at some places with a bit of a wider vibrato, so to speak, but his Calaf here is still very respectably sung. A great Nessun Dorma. His Act 1 interaction with Hincher is absolutely outstanding. And we come to Leila Hincher's Liu, her only recorded Liu. But it is absolutely, absolutely mind-blowing. You know that I love Hincher, you do. And her Liu here, it's basically Leontyne Price. I said that there was the earthiness to the voice, right? Hincher is a very, very earthy Liu, reminiscent of the innocent servant part of the role, the kind of peasantly facade of the role of Liu. But at the same time, we know that Hincher has that kind of... She floats those pianissimi very well. She has a kind of airy and floating voice, so to speak, very refined and very... It's just the Hincher sound. You can argue with that, and I don't think, in terms of the natural instrument, that there is a better voice than the natural Hincher instrument that is more suited to the role of Liu. And she uses that to every advantage here. At the end of Signore Ascolta, she just floats an immaculate pianissimo, barely hanging onto a thread. Then with the crescendo, she goes to, a really painful sound. And as Liu, you really can't get a better fit, vocally speaking, as Leila Hincher does here. Lucilla Udovic here as Turandot. She appeared as well in the 1958 film, Across Corelli. 4 years later here, her voice has gotten more... it's more veiled, it's more interpretive, not as straightforward as the 58 film, but here it's more pensive, more covered, not the biggest voice per se, but she has ringing high notes, and it's really a Turandot, in contrary to Nilsson's later Turandots where it just blast and fuck it. No, her Turandot here is very much idiomatic, in character, a mysterious Oriental princess, and this is what Udovic does in her later recording of the role of Turandot. And De Fabritis conducts very well here as well. Just that the sound quality is a bit underwhelming here, but very great recording anyway. Then 1966 at Covent Garden, we have Amy Sherwood in the role of Turandot. I mean, I'm not convinced by Sherwood's Turandot. Vocally speaking, there isn't much to blame. Very solid voice. She has ringing high notes. Not the biggest voice, but it has the Italian spinto quality to it, and it's vocally solid. It's well sung, but it's just very bland. It doesn't make you think of a role that it doesn't resemble anything. It doesn't have the mysterious Oriental quality, nor the spoiled quality of New Songs later Turandot. It's just there. It doesn't do anything for me. Corelli's Calaf here in 1966. You know, I've said that the 1966 broadcast at the Metropolitan, which was in December, I said that, and you know, his Non Cangerli was the best interpretation of the aria there ever, and that he was lacking in heroism in the riddle scene and Essendorma and whatnot. For whatever reason, however, here in May 1966 at Covent Garden, he doesn't, you know, sing Non Piangere Liu with emotional intensity. Obviously, he's trying to make it more emotionally oriented, the role of Calaf per se, but he's having an off night here. The voice is kind of uncontrolled. It has a wide vibrato, and the heroism is obviously lacking in the riddle scene in Essendorma when compared to, you know, what he did with the role of Calaf 6 years earlier. There's no debate that Corelli is still the best Calaf ever, though. I would easily take a 1966 Calaf over, you know, any other singer doing the role of Calaf. But in comparison to our earlier Calafs, it just pales in comparison, yeah? So here in 1966, May, Covent Garden, just kind of an off night for Corelli. He still sings great high Cs, great high notes, ringing high notes, however. Elizabeth Vaughan is Liu, again, kind of like Sherwood. The lyricism is there, the voice is there, vocally solid, a kind of nice lyric soprano voice, but it just doesn't remind you of anything, yeah? So, all in all, vocally speaking, Sherwood and Vaughan are respectable in their respective roles. Corelli, emotionally speaking, respectable, but just, you know, as a whole, it's not as, you know, as brilliant a performance you would like it, but it's still great because it has Corelli in it, and that's what matters. And Charles Mackerras here, very, very good conducting, and because the metallic, you know, sounds, big brassy sounds are there, the emotional, kind of refined, lush sounds are also there. Mackerras is one of my favorite conductors. He can do both big sounds and beautiful sounds equally as well, and it's very, very well represented here in Puccini's masterpiece. Then a 9-year break until we come to our next conclusion, which is in 1975 at the Arena di Verona. Now, this was Corelli's, you know, farewell tour, so to speak, and I think it was his last Calaf. This was his last Calaf, yeah? And obviously, 1975, his voice was not in, you know, very, very good voice. However, despite his kind of less controlled and kind of wider vibrato and whatnot, a kind of thinner sound to it. Despite all that, his interpretation of the role hasn't changed much. It's still very much emotionally oriented. If you can get past the semi-wobble, it's still a very, very great, very heroic sound. The bicep flexing quality is still there. You know, 5 years earlier at Macerata, obviously he's going all out. Here, in his final Calaf, he wants to, you know, leave on a high note, right? And that's why he sings with not much caution, and it is an exciting, truly exciting performance. His high Cs are still there, still ringing, and still very much a solid vocal quality, which we all want in the role of Calaf, yeah? So, for his last Calaf, aging nearly 60, it's a very, very respectable performance of the role, and historically very important as well, because Corelli is Calaf, Calaf is Corelli, and this was his last performance of the role, so historically very important, artistically not any worse as well. Danica Mastilovic as Turandot, she's kind of a dividing figure for me, you know. Early in her career, in the late 1960s to the mid-70s, she was an excellent dramatic soprano, a very dramatic voice, a translucent, kind of Nilsson-like quality, just blasting it all out, and a massive sound, and I love all of that. But here in 1975, she's starting to show signs of vocal decline. The solidness of the voice is still there. It's still a massive blasting voice, but you can really hear her wobble start to get out of control. And by 1979, her wobble was already quite unbearable, to be honest, and her voice thinned out, it weakened. So 75, she was still in good voice, but it was the start of a decline. But however, Corelli and Mastilovic, I think they go together well. And then Ovelia's Liu, again, great lyric voice. It has, its beautiful side, a very convincing timbre. Just not that she does a lot to the role, to be honest. It isn't complete, but the role of Khalaf, I think, is complete. We're missing about 30 minutes. But it doesn't matter because Corelli and his last Khalaf, that's all you need to know, yeah? Moving on from the Corelli-Nilsson nomination, we come to a recording that is very, very, very much an underrated recording. I really think so. It is from Venezia in 1966, conducted by Armando Le Rosa Parodi. Anna De Cavalieri, original name Anne McKnight, is Turandot, Daniele Barioni as Khalaf, Maria Chiara is Liu, Domenico Trimarchi Ping, Giuseppe Modesti is Timur. This recording is absolutely, absolutely top-notch. In fact, Daniele Barioni's Khalaf here, I think, is the only performance of Khalaf that can ever be compared to Corelli's Livorno 60. Why is that so? Let's start from Non Piangere Liu. Absolutely emotional singing. It's heartbreaking. It's direct, but very effective because there's this kind of tear-like quality innate in his voice. A kind of more sharp, sword-like quality that penetrates the orchestra, but with the kind of tear-like quality in the voice, it hits you directly, the kind of emotional quality of the voice, and very, very well sung on Piangere Liu at the end of Act 1, where, Khalaf sings Turandot, 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 and hits the gong. That A natural at the end of the last Turandot, I'm just gonna play it for you. 15 seconds. Imagine at the end of a strenuous act, a strenuous aria, hitting a B flat 2 times, you have to come to an A natural. Yeah, you have to run up the stairs. You have to hit the gong as loud as you can for 3 times. And while you hit the gong for those 3 times, you're holding an A natural for 15 seconds. It's insane. It's insane what he does here. After an absolutely emotional, moving, incredible performance of Non Piangere Liu, you pull that off. And that's not it. That's not it. That high C in Nono Principessa that I played for you earlier in the checkpoint section, plus the high C at the end of In Questa Regia, both of those are some of the best tenor high Cs that I've ever heard. It cuts through the entire orchestra. It cuts through your ears like a sword, and it's absolutely, absolutely incredible how confident and how striking his Khalaf is. Just boom, right at you. It's not like Corelli's virility, heroic voice. No, this is like a sword, just slicing at you, penetrating the entire orchestra. And those 2 high Cs are just absolutely incredible. You can't describe it with words, and I just can't fathom what it's like to hear that live. And then Nessun Dorma, again, so confident, so striking, with that, B natural, again, like a sword right at you. The final duet, so confident, so striking, and there was no doubt from the very start that he was going to win Turandot over. And that's it. Barioni, Turandot, 1966, Venezia, the only one that can be compared to Corelli at Livorno, in my opinion at least. The rest of the cast is not any worse as well. Anna De Cavalieri as Turandot. The year earlier, 1965, she made, a recording of Turandot with the Rai. That I will talk about in the later section of Dark Horses. There, her Turandot was more, she tried to go the more mysterious Oriental princess route, but that didn't really work well with her Italianate spinto voice. So here, live in the big theater at Venice, she just goes all out, direct yet effective, blast right at you, ringing high notes, and there's the pathos in the role as well, in Figlio del Cielo, ringing high Cs all around, and just the direct approach of this role is much, much more suited to her voice, and it's incredible. Maria Chiara, very early on in her career as Liu, again, a very, very well sung, very nuanced, lyrical, and pathos-filled reading of the role of Liu at the end of Signore Ascolta, that pianissimo to crescendo, that kind of maneuver, very, very well sung, and it really is a very convincing reading of the role of Liu. Giuseppe Modesti as Timur, comparing to 8 years earlier at La Scala. Here the voice is more dark, more deep, and more sonorous. It's a very, very emotional reading of the role, and just all in all, it's amazing. It's an absolutely amazing recording. But Barioni and his Act 1 finale blows you away. It doesn't get better than that, and that's all I have to say about this recording. Then our next recording is one from 1972, conducted by Oliviero de Fabritis with the Spanish Radio and TV Symphony Orchestra. Angelis Gulin here is Turandot, Placido Domingo, Calaf, Mirella Freni as Liu, Giovanni Foiani is Timur here. Angelis Gulin is very interesting casting as Turandot, because we know that, she's an Italian spinto voice, but you don't, really associate the role, a big, big role like Turandot, with a massive voice, to a voice like Gulin's. But it works. It's a kind of more lyrical and more inward, pensive reading of the role of Turandot. It lacks a bit of imposingness, to be honest, with her reading of the role, but the nuances are delivered with confidence, and all in all, it's a decent reading of the role of Turandot. It's not the best, but it's respectable. Domingo here is Calaf. He starts to sound a bit nasal here by 1972, and as his career went on, the heroicness of his voice just steadily decreased. So here his Calaf is not as heroic as the 69 and 70 recordings, but the emotional intensity, especially in Non Piangere Liu, and the more emotional sides and the emotional lines of Calaf, he still does that very well. Just that his voice and his technique is starting to get more and more unsteady. Mirella Freni here as Liu, it's not as good a reading of the role as she did 6 years earlier at the Metropolitan. The kind of transparent and the kind of innocence in the voice has started to decrease a little bit. It doesn't sound as transparent as crystalline as before, and the nuances, the kind of silkiness of the voice is also no longer as prevalent as it was in 1966. However, the three leads, also with Giovanni Foiani Timur, they're still in good voice. They still give respectable interpretations of the roles. None of them are really the real star here, but none of them are, ruining the recording, so to speak. And very balanced all around, a decent recording of this opera. Now, Dark Horses. We'll start with one that is absolutely overlooked, but is absolutely top class. This is from 1938, the second complete recording of Turandot, actually, conducted by Joseph Kielberth, with the Reichssender Stuttgart, obviously in German, Maria Sebotari, Turandot, Karl Haus, Calaf, Trude Eperl as Liu, and George Hahn as Timur. Maria Sebotari as Turandot is absolutely top class, and I'll tell you why. Sebotari, she has the youth in her voice. It sounds young. It sounds like an attractive princess, a mysterious oriental princess, which would attract Calaf, yeah? That's there. But she uses a lot of chest voice, coordinated chest voice, and actual chest voice. And that creates a sense of solemnness and or pain at some points. And her In Questa Regia is one of the best that I've ever heard. The chest voice is present all throughout the aria. At the very start, it's imposing with the chest voice. You know, there's this youth in the voice, right? He sounds like a young girl, but then comes the chest voice, and it's imposing. It's absolutely imposing. There's this solemn quality to the atmosphere. Then, as the aria progresses, she uses more chest voice, and you can hear the suffering and the pain of Turandot as she tells the tale of Lo Lin, yeah? The pain is there. It is absolutely a dramatic reading of the role. She really puts herself into the role of Turandot. And her high notes are ringing, they're absolutely massive. The squillo is there, all of that is there. And it's as balanced a Turandot you would want. And she excels in every single facade of the role of Turandot. And that's not something that you can say very often. Karl Haus as Calaf, it has this, held in tenor quality, but unlike Hans Hoff, which I'll talk about in my next recording, unlike Hans Hoff, he is not that big, beefy held in tenor sound. He's a held in tenor with a cutting, a sharp-edged voice, like, a Siegfried kind of voice, with absolutely ringing high Cs that go right at you, penetrate the orchestra, cuts right through your ears, and it's direct and a very, very effective approach. That sharp-edged voice, and somehow he manages to use that kind of sharp-edged quality to create a very, very moving Act 1 finale. With his Non piangere Liu, is still very, very emotional in quality. It's very engaged. Not something that you would expect from this kind of sharp-edged Helen tenor, but he does it. Through the E Perle as Liu, beautiful instrument in nature, very lyrical and very pensive. The kind of transparence and the velvety legato in her voice. Very, very great interpretation, great instrument, very great Liu. George Han, a bit, not the biggest voice you get, but still very emotional as Timur. But Sebatari really, really steals the show here. Keelberth conducts absolutely fantastically here. He brings out every detail, big brassy sounds, pushing the drama on, and Sebatari is the real star here. And what can I say? What a recording. I really, really mean it. Next, we have another German radio recording. This is from 1956, with Georg Schulte conducting the Sinfonie Orchestra of the Westdeutschen Rundfunks of Cologne. Christel Goltz is Turandot, Hans Hoff Calaf. Teresa Stitch-Randall is the Liu. Luxury casting with the ministers, Horst Gunther as Ping, Peter Offermans as Pang, and Jürgen Förster as Pang, and Willem Schurp is Timur. Let's start with Goltz, shall we? Christel Goltz, in my opinion, much better as Turandot than as Salome. We all think, oh, Goltz, Salome, Electra, but Turandot, I think, is where she really makes her mark. Why so? I've talked about, Germanic Turandots like Ingeborg, like Christensen, but here, Goltz not only gives that mysterious Oriental facade to Turandot, that veiled quality to the role. Not only does she do that, but firstly, she engages chest voice, that provides the solemnness and the suffering of Turandot, just like Sebatari does. But also, she uses that to her advantage to make a very, very imposing quality of the role. It's not as youthful as Sebatari per se, but it's definitely more imposing because she has massive a voice, ringing high notes, and she just goes all out. She blasts those notes, a massive voice, very imposing in nature, and with that mysterious veiled quality when it's needed, Goltz makes it absolutely top class Turandot. Hans Hoff as Calaf, very big, very beefy voice, kind of baritonal in nature. Am I convinced? Not really, because it lacks that kind of sharp cutting quality that a confident Calaf should have, and a confident striking interpretation of the role that can win Turandot over. However, Calaf, Hans Hoff is just too beefy for me, yeah? But you can't, you can't deny that he is very confident here, because he sings those high Cs without any hesitation, just goes for it, blasts it, and it's there. Baritonal in nature. His Nessun Dorma is well sung. Non piangere Liu is emotional. It's lacking that kind of striking quality in the riddle scene, but all in all, it's not a bad interpretation of the role per se. I'm just not convinced, yeah. Teresa Stitch Randall as Liu. I just talked about Schwarzkopf's Mozartian liu and how that's not to my taste, right? Stitch Randall, again, a very Mozartian singer, but she uses that to her advantage here as Liu, and it's very, very impressive, the results. How's that so? Because she takes her voice with that kind of seductive Mozartian quality, she brings it apart with that creaminess in the voice, right? That legato creaminess in the Mozart. But then she focuses on the transparent quality of her voice, and she finds the balance to the point where it's creamy, it has legato, but it also has that transparent innocence in the voice, and that B flat pianissimo to crescendo at the end of Signore Ascolta, which I showed at the start of this of the video at the checkpoints. It's really something that blows you away, and it's one of the best versions of her aria that I've ever heard. Again, the rest of the cast, very luxurious casting. George Schulte, I'm not a big fan of him at all, but Turandot is, one of his less unlistenable operas because it's all about brass and metal and stuff. And he uses that to his advantage. He doesn't really go overboard as he would do in, Verdi and stuff, because that's what Puccini wanted. He wanted a big brassy sound, and Schulte does that. Although, I'm still not convinced, yeah. But Crystal Goltz and Stitch Randall here are absolutely, absolutely top class. Then we have here a live recording, conducted by Edward Downes, 1963, at Covent Garden. Amy Stewart is Turandot, Bruno Pravedi, Calaf, Raina Kabaivanska is Liu. The three ministers are Peter Glossop, John Lanigan, and Kenneth MacDonald. Joseph Arulo is Timur. What do you think about this recording? Amy Stewart's Turandot I've talked about, not very different from the 66 with Corelli, I would say. So, yeah, solid vocally, but not very impressive. Bruno Pravedi as Calaf. He has that kind of Delmonico, Melochian, solid cutting sound, mixed with Corelli's kind of bluish, tear-like timbre. So it's a mix between Delmonico and Corelli. So you would think that would make a very good Calaf. Vocally speaking, indeed it is, but it's just a bit too dry for my taste because there isn't that striking, confident heroism that we need in the real scene, and there really isn't that emotional engagement in the Act 1 finale and the more lyrical, emotional parts of the character of Calaf. So, similar to Stewart, really isn't, any faults vocally speaking, but interpretationally speaking, just not very convincing. Raina Kabaivanska as Liu, later in her career, I really like her because she developed this kind of lyric, but kind of legato, kind of really beautiful timbre, and really great interpretation later in her career. Her Tosca, I really, really adore. But here, relatively early in her career, it's still kind of a raw and unrefined timbre, so you can hear that the beautiful instrument is still there, but a little bit of refinement is needed, and her liu is just sung, not interpreted, in my opinion. So yeah, vocally speaking, in these three leads, you can't go wrong with them. They sing well. It's a good recording. Just a bit lacking in terms of interpretation, but generally speaking, it's still a decent recording. Then, from 1965, another radio recording this time with the Rai Orchestra of Rome. Ferruccio Scaglia conducts Anna di Cavalieri is Turandot, Gianfranco Cecchele Calaf, Lydia Marin-Pietri is Liu, and the ministers are absolutely, absolutely luxurious casting. Giuseppe Valdengo as Ping, Mario Carlin as Pang, and Tommaso Frascati as Pong. Yeah, the Cavalieri, I've talked about how her Turandot in this recording is more spinto, more covered, more veiled in comparison to her 1966 live at Venice. And that's true, it's more, interpretationally oriented, which some of you might like, some of you wouldn't. But you can't deny that it's a very, very interesting and intriguing reading of the role. Because, well, the top notes are still there, it's still ringing, but you can also hear an extra layer of kind of mysteriousness in the reading of this role of Turandot. It's just that I slightly prefer the 66 Venice with a more all-out approach. Gianfranco Cecchele is Calaf here. In all honesty, he sounds identical to Delmonico here, and I think that he makes a better, Calaf than Delmonico in his studio recording. Because he sounds so similar to Delmonico here, you can't really tell the difference. But what he has, when compared to Delmonico, is that he has the interpretation. He has a more sword-like quality to the edge of the voice. The inside of the voice is quite similar to Delmonico, but there's just more squillo at the edges, which cuts through the orchestra. serves him really well in, Nona Principessa, where he takes that amazing high C cutting through the orchestra, which Delmonico didn't attempt. Not as beefy a sound as Delmonico, but cutting through the orchestra is what you want. The timbre is the same, but Nessun Dorma, again, cutting through the orchestra, the timbre is the same, but those sharp edges just really plays to Cachele's advantage in the role of Calaf, and he really interprets the emotional suffering and the internal struggle of Calaf in Act 1 and in some parts of Act 3. Yeah, so Cachele as Calaf, just basically a better version of Delmonico, to be honest, because the timbre is identical, but Cachele does much more to the role than Delmonico did. Lydia Marin-Pietri as Liu, a very lyrical voice, a decent instrument, a little bit too soubrette-like, if I had to pick out some flaws, but still, generally speaking, a decent Liu with nice legato, nice pianissimi, and generally a respectable interpretation of the role. The ministers here and their scenes are really intriguing. They really make you want to listen to it as opposed to in other recordings, because Giuseppe Valdengo as Ping is just really striking and really handsome reading of the role. Yeah, it makes you want to listen to it. And Mario Carlin as Pang does the same thing. Handsome, striking, not just some onlookers, some kind of useless compromario roles. It doesn't make you think so, because Valdengo, Carlin, Frascati is great as well. Scalia conducts well. All in all, great recording. And Cachele's Calaf is something that you wouldn't expect to be better than Delmonico, but it's a revelation, and I really love this recording. Then we have a recording from 1973. This is from the Vienna Staatsoper. Danica Mastilovic is Turandot, Ludovic Spies is Calaf, Katia Ricciarelli is Liu, Tugomir Frank, Timur, and the three ministers are Hans Helm, Heinz Zetnik, and Marie Dickey. Altom is Kurt Equiluz and Anton Guadagno conducts. Danica Mastilovic as Turandot I've talked about in the 1975 recording with Corelli, but here 2 years prior. Firstly, the wobble is way not as significant, and her vibrato is still wide, but it's very much listenable here. And she is in much fresher, much direct voice here. It's one that is imposing, it is fearless, and an interpretation here that just straightforward and imposing. And this Turandot is one that I absolutely adore from Mastilovic, and that imposing quality is much better than the 75 at Verona, and I absolutely love this. Ludovic Spies as Calaf here. Spies, very great tenor with a very emotional timbre. It has the innate tear-like quality in his voice. It has the heroic quality, it has the virility. It's not, like Filippeschi or Barioni, a voice that really cuts through the orchestra, a thin, sharp-edged sword-like voice. But this one is one that has, a rounded quality to it, but at the same time it has very emotional, very rounded, and very tear-like, poignant quality to his voice. And for that reason, his Non Piangere Liu is sung absolutely fantastically, and his heroism in the voice really serves him well in the riddle scene, in Nessun Dorma, all of that. The heroism, the kind of virility in the voice really works well, but what really makes his voice stand apart is the emotional quality in the Act 1. He struggles a bit with the high notes, to be honest, which we don't have in the 1970 telecast. That one I would talk about in the video recordings section. He's not in as good form here in 1973 than in 1970, but it's still a very well sung Calaf. Katia Ricciarelli as Liu. Now, 8 years after this, she recorded the title role with Karajan, wrecked her voice. 2 years after that title role, she returned to Liu under Mazo, again a train wreck. But here, 1973, at the very start of her career, she had a very natural and very beautiful instrument. It's transparent, it's direct, and it has that kind of innocent quality to it that we need in the role of Liu, and is a very good reading of the role. She can pull off a very beautiful pianissimi. You would say it's lacking a bit in nuance, but the instrument makes up for it, to be honest. Tugomir Frank as Timur, again not the biggest or or the deepest voice, but it's very, very emotional in quality, and I would dare say one of the most moving interpretations of the role of Timur, which is what it's all about. Yeah, the ministers are well sung, but Masilovic and Spies here are really in top form, and that makes this recording a very, very valuable document, and it's really enjoyable. Our next category, films and video recordings. We have 2 films followed by 3 video recordings. Let's talk about the first one. Most of you should know about this. It's the 1958 film under Fernando Previtali with the Rai Milan Orchestra. Lucilla Udovic as Turandot, Franco Corelli's Calaf, Renata Mattioli as Liu. The 3 ministers are Mario Bariello, Mario Carlin, and Renato Ercolani. Plinio Calabasi is Timur. Most of you would have, seen this movie. It's one of the most famous TV opera movies of all time. Udovic as Turandot, I've talked about, her 62 recording, which is more veiled, more mysterious in nature. Here, 58, she's in fresher voice, a more direct, and, it's still a sort of lyrical voice per se, but she uses it more to her advantage here because she sings more directly. She has those ringing high notes here, and her physical presence is very, very well matched with her vocal presence here in this movie as Turandot. But Franco Corelli, his Calaf here, oh my word, you can't make this up, yeah? Non Piangere Liu, I don't really, enjoy it given that his later Non Piangere Lius are so much better. But I mean, his Nessun Dorma and his riddle scene here are absolutely top class. You can hear the youth, the freshness, the young, reckless quality of Calaf. That is so impetuous in getting to Turandot. You really hear that young, fresh, exciting Corelli here, which in Nessun Dorma, is absolutely incredible because it's exciting. You know that he's looking forward to that duel with Turandot, and I'll win you over. That young, impetuous quality is absolutely there. And the riddle scene, you can hear, very, very incredible high C on Nono Principessa, and not as good as the Livorno one's live. But here, that young, fresh, impetuous, exciting quality of the voice of Corelli's Calaf is absolutely stunning. Not to forget his physical presence in this movie. Oh my god. Just looking at it, you understand why Turandot would, succumb to Calaf's approaches, because Corelli, I mean, that sums it up, yeah. Renata Mattioli as Liu, again, nice instrument, very well sung. A bit lacking in interpretation, I would say. The 3 ministers are very well cast. Carlin Ercolani sing exceptionally. Bariello is a nice lyrical. Plinio Calabasi as Timur, a bit lacking in emotional engagement. It's not as moving as you love it, but it's still very dark, very deep voice. Previtali is decent here. It's in black and white as usual. It's 1958. But it's quite the experience. It's my first full Turandot. I mean, it would be many people's first full Turandot. But Corelli here is just in absolutely top form. And you just look at him on stage, on set, in the production. Yes, Franco Corelli and his legendary Turandot movie. It just doesn't get better than that. Then we have another film from 1969, this time with the Rai Orchestra of Turin. George Pretre conducts, Birgit Nilsson as Turandot, Gianfranco Piccelli as Calaf, and Gabriella Tucci as Liu. Franco Bardoni here is the mandarin. Nilsson here in this movie, it's great that we have video representation of Nilsson's Turandot, because, well, she is Turandot after all, but she just isn't in her best form here, to be honest. The high notes are still there, they're still ringing, but 1969, it's not Verona, it's in studio. So yeah, it's just underwhelming. She uses her, coordinated chest voice, that kind of spoiled quality, but vocally speaking, it's just weak and it's underwhelming. It doesn't have that imposing Turandot quality. It just sounds uninspired to some extent. But hey, it's still Nilsson in a Turandot. She's still blasting notes like crazy. Still very imposing sound, and her instrument makes up for it. It's just not her best Turandot. Same case as Gianfranco Piccelli's Calaf. I've said that his 1965 radio recording was absolutely top notch. Here, not really. He sounds tired. again, uninspired in the role of Calaf. He still has that heroic sound in Nessun Dorma in the riddle scene, but it's a bit tired. It's just, uninspired. He doesn't really put himself into the character of Calaf as he does in the radio recording, and the Act 1 is just boring. There just isn't enough emotional engagement at all. Gabriella Tucci's Liu, by 1969, her voice wasn't in, very great condition. The instrument is still there, but she's just resorted to singing more unrefined, and it's just not great in terms of interpretation. For all three leads, to be honest, yeah. But well, there's still three great artists with great instruments, and a video representation of Nilsson Turandot is always crucial to her interpretation and her legacy in this role. Just vocally speaking, it's a bit underwhelming. I would say that it's a good recording though. Just for Nilsson, we can see her act in the role of Turandot. Then we have 3 video recordings. The first one is a recording of Turandot in concert. It is conducted by Karol Litvin with the orchestra of the Radio Television of Romania. Maria Slatinaru is Turandot, Ludovic Spice Calaf, Teodora Lukaciu is Liu, and we see very, very luxurious castings in the ministers again. Octav Enigarescu is Ping, Valentin Terodorian is Pang, and Corneliu Finateanu is Pong. Slatinaru first, that's Turandot. Lyric voice, definitely a lyric voice. It doesn't have the imposing quality that you would want for Turandot, but it is, mysterious. It is lyric in quality. It is beautiful, and it makes for a attractive Turandot that we don't often get. Of course, it's still lacking in, vocal imposingness. She doesn't have ringing high notes, massive notes that blast out of her throat. She doesn't have that, but still, it's decent because her beauty of tone makes up for that. I just think that she'd make a better Liu than a Turandot, to be honest. Ludovic Spice here as Calaf, I've talked about him. Here in 1970, he had, much better high notes. He went for the C here in Nano Principessa. He did it in 1973 at Vienna, and that high C was really, really well sung here. And his Nessun Dorma, again, virile in quality. The emotional intensity and the tear-like quality in his voice did not falter here earlier in his career. It's still there. It's still a very emotional reading of Act 1. Teodora Lukaciu as Liu, very fine lyric voice with, capable of pulling off pianissimi, very beautiful, very transparent voice. Enigarescu, a very handsome Ping, and Corneliu Fanateanu, soon to be star tenor, is in a very small role of Pong here. And all in all, it's very, very high quality of singing, considering it's just, a local Romanian concert. But it is of very high quality indeed. Then, a 1981 live recording, video recording from the Paris Opera, conducted by Seiji Ozawa. It has Montserrat Caballé here in the title role of Turandot, Giuseppe Giacomini as Calaf, and Leona Mitchell as Liu. The Emperor Tome is sung by Michel Sénéchal. Caballé as Turandot, I've said that she is an absolutely fantastic Liu. But her Turandot, it's kind of conflicting, because at the same time I feel like the lyric timbre of her voice brings out the kind of mysteriousness in the role of Turandot that we want. However, I just feel like the imposingness is not there because that her voice is kind of thin in nature, and that's why when she tries to sing, loud, tries to push her voice to rise over the orchestra, it sounds a bit forced and a bit awkward. But in the more non-confrontational parts of Turandot's role, Caballé really makes good use of her lyric timbre to bring out the nuances of the role of Turandot. It's a very, very nuanced reading of the role. Just vocally speaking, insufficient. Giuseppe Giacomini as Calaf. Here in 1981, his voice was more spinto than baritonal, as his voice would become later on in his career. But the spinto voice made for a heroic reading of the role of Calaf. It's not very nuanced, it's more straightforward, but the kind of metallic quality in his voice serves the role of Calaf well in the riddle scene, in Nessun Dorma, and the stage presence is also very incredible of Giacomini. Leona Mitchell as Liu, nice timbre, with a lyric voice, a great instrument. Interpretationally speaking, nothing wrong with that at all. It's just not a very, it's not the best Liu you can get. It's not the most impressive you can get, but still a very decent, very well sung interpretation of the role of Liu. Seiji Ozawa, a bit underpowered at times, but still manages the entire atmosphere of the opera well. Yeah, so this recording isn't the best video recording that you can get, but it's still decent, I would say. For our last video recording, it is from 1987 from Covent Garden with Jacques Delecourt conducting, with Jones as Turandot, Franco Bonisoli Calaf, Cynthia Hayman as Liu, and John Dobson as Altome. Yeah, let's start with Gwyneth Jones Turandot. In the 1980s, her voice started to loosen. There was, a more significant wobble than she did previously, and by 1987 her voice was pretty much out of control. Although in the Electra video, which I talked about, a role that is, highly just entirely consisted of blasting metallic quality, she does those roles well, well into the 1990s, because her throat, her vocal cords have become more, metallified. It become like steel, and she had no problem blasting, high notes out with that steelish quality. However, in roles that require more nuance and more lyrical singing, her vocal state didn't serve her well, because her voice was more or less out of control. Here, as Turandot, I would say that for the majority of her role, which requires more of blasting and getting those metallic notes out of her throat, she does that well, because by the 80s all she could do was blast at maximum volume, and that's what she does. That's what Turandot has to do. The nuance of her voice, the natural timbre, is still there, and it is, it's a worthwhile addition to the interpretation, the entire atmosphere of the role of Turandot, which she does well. And I think even in the more lyrical parts like Filo del Cielo, she sings well. She blasts high Cs that are secure and ringing. And generally speaking, I really like this Turandot. Although, by the 80s, much of Jones' singing was quite frankly unlistenable. This was one of the exceptions. Franco Bonisoli as Calaf. Now, this is something that is extremely dividing. I don't like it, to be honest. I really don't like it. Bonisoli was a lyric tenor that could do very dramatic roles. He could sing Otello, he could sing really anything that he wanted to sing. He could sing Rossini as well, well into the 80s. But the thing about Bonisoli's voice is that even though it's heroic, there's this kind of undertone to the voice where it just sounds arrogant. It's his personality presented into his voice. Somehow they merge together, his personality and what he sings, and in his voice there's just this undertone which is a bit unpleasant to listen to. So although that he has a heroic timbre, his singing isn't always necessarily convincing, just because of the kind of, I don't know how, but the ego that he has is presented in his sound. And not to forget the high Cs that he does on Nono Principessa. He does 4 high Cs in a row. And I never understood that decision. It's musically doesn't make any sense at all. He just wanted to show off, and I know Calaf is supposed to be striking and supposed to be confident, but you've already altered the musical line in Nona Principessa, and now you're gonna alter it even more so that it doesn't make any sense musically. So yeah, I don't like that. Cynthia Hayman as Liu, again, really nothing to write home about. Robert Lloyd is weak as Timur. John Dobson is a good Altome, but Gwyneth Jones is really the only reason why this recording is worthwhile. But Jones alone puts this recording on the list. Now, commercial recordings to avoid. Let's start with Zubin Mehta's 1972 recording. Probably the most famous recording of Turandot. In studio, London Philharmonic Orchestra, Joan Sutherland as Turandot, Luciano Pavarotti as Calaf, Montserrat Caballé as Liu, Tom Krause, Pier Francesco Poli, and Piero de Palma as the 3 ministers, Nikolai Khairov as Timur, and Peter Pears as Altome. Sounds great on paper, but it just doesn't work. the rest of the opera is absolutely brilliant. It's very well sung. Khayyurov's Timur is absolutely brilliant, very emotional, very moving. Peter Pears is a very convincing alto. Tom Ping is heroic. It's it's comic in nature, but it also very well sung. A solid voice. Montserrat Caballé's Liu doesn't need talking about. It's absolutely glorious. Her Signore Ascolta here is one of the best versions of the aria that I've ever heard. The pianissimo that she floats, the B flat at the very end, is amazing how she floats that note. Zubin Mehta is in great form. The London Philharmonic Orchestra is in great form. But Sutherland and Pavarotti, what were they thinking when they casted the two roles that consisted 90% of the opera? Sutherland as Turandot was never ever going to work. Yes, she had the dramatic undertone in her voice, although that she was a coloratura soprano. But this is in studio. It doesn't mean that you can do anything you want. The thing is, she doesn't have big enough a voice, and that's why she has to, she has to focus on getting a big sound out. She has a big sound, but she has to force it out. And that completely destroys any sense of nuance, any sense of mysteriousness in the role of Turandot. She doesn't have big enough a voice to be an imposing Turandot. She doesn't have, that acidic quality to make a spoiled Turandot. She doesn't have enough, nuance to make a mysterious Turandot. And what we have is just a weird, awkward singing. It's not an interpretation of the role, she's just singing it, and it doesn't work at all for me. Pavarotti as Calaf, another thing which I have absolutely no idea what they were thinking about when they casted it. Well, of course we know that Pavarotti, Nessun Dorma, this was the opera, this was the recording that made him so famous, yeah, but it just doesn't work at all. His Non Piangere Liu is, he had that thin kind of leggero tenor quality, and it's just thin. It isn't emotionally moving. It doesn't have enough size or intention to make a believable Calaf. His Non Piangere Liu, it's not, sizable. It's not moving enough a voice to make it sound convincing. His riddle scene is just weird because he's trying to yell, and that destroys his timbre. And Nessun Dorma, again, I still like it because Pavarotti, it's my introduction to opera. It still holds a position in my heart, but honestly speaking, vocally, it's just a mess. It doesn't go anywhere. It's a thin, weak, and feeble voice that does not do any justice to either the emotional intensity or the heroism of the role of Calaf. Caballé is absolutely amazing here, so is Khayyurov, so is Kraus. I like Pears, I like Mehta, but what the fuck were they thinking when they casted Sutherland and Pavarotti in 90% of the opera? I just don't get it, because it has the potential to be such a great recording, but when at the end it comes out, it's just something that no one wants to care about. Then we have a 1977 studio recording with Alain Lombard conducting the Philharmonic Orchestra of Strasbourg, Montserrat Caballé is Turandot here, Jose Carreras Calaf, Mirella Frenius Liu, Vincenzo Zardinero is Ping, and Paul Pliszka Timur. Caballé is Turandot I've already talked about, but here in studio, she feels that she doesn't have the need to amplify her voice because it's in studio, and the audio engineers can tamper with it however they like to. So there isn't any imposing quality in the voice at all. She just sings the role as if it's, some kind of Donizetti role, and there isn't any metallic quality, imposing quality in the role of Turandot. The nuance is not even present because she's just trying to sing every single note and feeling that it's in studio anyway and people wouldn't care. And it just baffles me how her Turandot in studio is even worse than the one she did live, because it doesn't make sense at all to me. It's just bland and uninspiring as Turandot. Jose Carreras as Calaf, complete mess, even worse than Pavarotti. It's weak. It's like a leggero tenor doing Calaf. There isn't any trace of any heroism anywhere to be found, and I just don't get how you can come up to the score of Calaf with that voice and you just end up yelling, screaming, destroying your timbre, and that's what happened to him. Mirella Freni, I've already said that her 72 Liu was not as refined as the 66 Liu, and her 77, it's just worse, because Karajan was getting her to do Elisabetta, Aida by 1977, and her voice was already, it was frankly a mess, because she had to make her vocal cords kind of metallic, kind of, strengthened into, steel to do Verdi roles without, sounding like an absolute mess. And that's why she lost all of her lyricism here as Liu, and it doesn't. It makes you think. Just 10 years before this, she was an absolutely top class Liu at the Met, but this is not something that you would want to listen to be honest. And all in all, this recording is just a mess. I mean, I've talked about Caballés Turandot and Freni's Liu as good examples of great recordings, but somehow, in the same roles, in studio, it's an absolute mess. But it gets worse. Karajan 81 Vienna Phil Turandot. Atrocious recording. Absolutely atrocious. Katia Ricciarelli as Turandot, Domingo Calaf, Barbara Hendricks as Liu, Ruggero Raimondi as Timur. How do you mess up so bad that you cast this kind of cast in Turandot? Katia Ricciarelli as Turandot. She sounds absolutely painful doing this role. She has, very, very lyric, very delicate voice. And once you hand her the score of Turandot, it's over. Her voice is over. She can't sing anything anymore. And 2 years after this, live, she sang Liu again, and she could barely be audible. It just wrecked her. This Turandot wrecked her entire career, to be honest. And Karajan wrecked her entire career. And she just resorts to shouting in this Turandot. And even when she shouts, it's not big enough a voice to be audible. It's just very painful yelling, and all the lyricism, all the beauty in her voice is gone. She's just trying to not get massacred by the orchestra. It's the Vienna Phil, it's a brassy sound, and she's just trying not to get demolished, and that's why she yells without any nuance, without any beauty. It's ugly, it's painful to hear her Turandot. Domingo as Calaf, by 1980, there was nothing that he sang that was listenable, to be honest. 1972, I still said that his Calaf was listenable. It still had emotional intensity in here, although with no heroism. Here in 1981, don't talk about any sense of heroism. There isn't even any emotional intensity left. All that's left is a giant nasal singing, yelling over the orchestra, painful, strained high notes, a terribly pasted high C in Nono Principessa, and his Nessun Dorma, again painful, just very nasal throughout and very strained, because the tessitura and the size, the Fach of Calaf, a full dramatic, nearing Heldon tenor territory, and he just has to resort to yelling, and it's never good if you yell, and his Calaf is a mess. Barbara Hendricks as Liu, again, what the fuck was Karajan thinking? Her voice isn't even beautiful in nature. It's just a small, weak, and unnuanced voice, and she's just singing the role with that small soubrette voice of hers. There's no moving quality anywhere to be heard, and it's just very underwhelming. Ruggero Raimondi as Timur. It sounds like a tenor, frankly. And Timur isn't even that difficult a role for you to be singing. It's just you have to have great emotional intensity, a dark, deep bass voice, and somehow you cast a tenor-like timbre in Timur. Piero De Palma is probably the only listenable singer in this entire set, with his 2 minutes as alto. Karajan, again, is completely out of his comfort zone, conducting brassy, big Turandot, Puccini stuff. It just doesn't work at all. Nothing about this recording works, and it's an absolute fucking mess. And for some people to consider this the best recording of Turandot ever, I don't know what's wrong with them. And it's crazy how DG is still selling this as one of their top selling albums in 2022. Have people not realized that this is an absolute tragedy to begin with? Then, two very commercially available video recordings of Turandot. We'll start with one from 1983, conducted by Lauren Mazo at the Wiener Staatsoper. Eva Marton is Turandot, Carreras is Calaf, Katia Ricciarelli is Liu. Eva Martons Turandot. I just don't think that she's a great fit for Annie Puccini, to be honest. Quite honestly speaking, her Turandot is just a wobbly mess all over. She doesn't have enough metallic quality in her voice to be imposing, and because she tries to sound imposing, even though she doesn't have the instrument to do so, she just tries to sound big, and that's why she sounds actually wobbly. Her wobble is uncontrollable, and then she sacrifices all the nuances of the role of Turandot to make it. It's neither interpretively impressive, as in, mysterious or spoiled or anything. There is no interpretation whatsoever, and vocally speaking, it's not imposing at all as well, because she had a Verdian voice, but you can't take that and try to yell and scream and get the most so to speak, the biggest voice you can get, and the result is just a big wobbly mess. Carrera Sierra's Calaf, tragedy, unlistenable. You can't hear him at all. Very painful Nessun Dorma, very painful riddle scene. And the act one is just, he's singing with the ruins of his voice after, trying to sing Calaf. Of course, you're not going to expect any good results when you literally have the voice of a leggero tenor. And yeah, his voice was wrecked by the 70s, and here it is absolutely painful to listen to. And yeah, Ricciarelli as Liu here, I've said that her 81 Karajan Turandot in the title role actually wrecked her voice. She doesn't sound like anything here. She's, barely audible. No more beauty whatsoever in her voice. It's just ruins of a voice that was previously beautiful. It's just nowhere. You can't even listen to it. It's inaudible. And yeah, the only, good part about this recording is Valdemar Kment's alto. It's well sung, but again, 2 minutes. What are you expecting? Mazo is again. He just tries to get through the orchestra. There's no nuance whatsoever. The big parts, the brassy parts, aren't brassy enough. The lush parts aren't lush enough. And all in all, it's just not something that you want to listen to, yeah? And I struggle to comprehend why this is a video recording that is so commercially available that you can find, easily find on the market, and neither of the two films with Corelli and Nilsson are. And our last one, yet another video recording of a live performance, which is widely commercially available. This is the DG release of the 1987 Metropolitan Turandot, with James Levine conducting, Eva Marton, Placido Domingo, and Leona Mitchell. Now, I've talked about the problems of Marton's Turandot and the problems of Domingo's late Calaf. Yeah, both of them are just painful to hear in this recording. Domingo cracked very spectacularly on the high C in Questa Regia. And he cracked again in Nessun Dorma. He even cracked in Non Piangere Liu on the B flat. So you're basically cracking anything above the stave, and for some reason, you just decide to fix those cracks, paste some other random lads high notes over it, and release it to the public as one of the best recordings of Turandot. No, it's just cheating. It's just blatant cheating, and Domingo is cracking here and there. Absolutely painful to listen to. Very strained voice, and you just don't want to listen to his Calaf. Marton, same problem. Leona Mitchell here as Liu is, 5 years after that Paris Turandot, where she sang a decent Liu, her voice had already deteriorated. There was, a lack of beauty in her timbre at this point. Poplishka as Timur is weak, and it doesn't really have, any emotional intensity to it. However, Hugo Kinode, as Altome here is a revelation. It's always tough to debut at the Metropolitan Opera at the age of 84. And he continued singing until 90. And that's crazy, Yeah, he was singing in the 30s and managed to pull off this Altome of very high quality at the Metropolitan at the age of 84. So for that 2 minutes of singing, you can look at it, but just Domingo, how do you crack 10 times? The only 10 times that you have to sing above the stuff, you crack them all. And it just blows me away how DG can look at this performance and go, oh wow, this is a great Turandot. Let's just release it in the form of a video recording and hope that everyone buys it. And people actually buy it. It's beyond me. Now we come to the category of good excerpts from the opera. The first one we have is absolutely amazing. It is the 1937 Barbirolli Turandot excerpts. Now these are from two separate days, where we have the Act 1 finale, the entirety of the riddle scene and Nessun Dorma. We have all three of these excerpts recorded on both days, and both days have Eva Turner as Turandot, Giovanni Martinelli as Calaf, and we have Lucia Albanese in her Signore Ascolta. Yeah, so Eva Turner's Turandot is absolutely generational. There isn't that, Italian red hot quality to the voice, but it's a truly enigmatic Turandot, something that you really don't get from any other Turandot. It's a very imposing, a strong metallic voice, but at the same time, it has the very pained, it has the solemn quality, the enigmatic, mysterious quality of Sebotari's Turandot, but with the metallic imposingness as well. And Eva Turner is just one of my favorite Turandots ever. And on both of these days, she sings absolutely amazingly. That B natural on quel grado that I put earlier in the checkpoints is executed absolutely perfectly. The rest of the riddle scene, she sings with the same solemnness while having that imposing metallic quality. Martinelli sings his Non piangere Liu and his Nessun Dorma with emotional intensity and with great vocal heroism. His high notes are ringing. They are heroic in nature. He manages a very emotionally convincing Non piangere Liu. Lucia Albanese, very early in her career, sings a pure and very innocent, creamy Non piangere Liu. And all in all, it's just Martinelli and Turner. It's Turner that steals the show. On both of these days, she is at her very, very best. Barbaroli conducts extremely well here with, bringing out the nuances, the details of Puccini's score. And I just can't get over Turner's Turandot. It's so amazing. Then we have Carla's live Turandot. Now, there's this, recording circulating out there of Carla's riddle scene from 1949 live at Buenos Aires with Mario Delmonico. The entire thing is a fake. But there are 2 minutes at the end of the opera which are real, which isn't, in the riddle scene, obviously. And let's just break down why the riddle scene is fake. They've proven it. It's just, Maria Callas' 1954 studio recording of In Questa Regia. The riddle scene is taken from the 1957 Seraphin complete recording. Delmonico's lines are all taken, obviously, from his only recording of the opera. And they just merged that together into one recording and, made the sound quality deliberately absolutely shit and just, oh, this is a live recording from 1949. It isn't. Anyway, the 2 minutes that we have, which is the only, real recording of Delmonico and Callas' live Turandot. These 2 minutes come at the end of the final duet, starting from Delmonico's line, Io son Calaf, figlio di Timur, and ends with Turandot's only line at the end of the opera in front of Altome before the chorus comes in. You can hear how massive, how monstrous these two voices are live at the very, very prime of their career. Callas, a massive voice. Delmonico, a massive voice. Delmonico has an absolutely massive B flat here. Very, very high tessitura. With a few A flats and G naturals in a row. Turandot the same. Callas, with a B natural. The entire thing here is above the stave. And somehow she sings it with so much power. The vocal intensity and the dramatic intensity of her Turandot is present. You can hear how her live Turandot would have actually sounded with just 2 minutes of singing. You can envision her entire live Turandot. And it is absolutely, absolutely miraculous singing, although it just lasts 2 minutes. And that's basically Calaf's live 1949 Buenos Aires Turandot. And we're just, we just want more. Then we have the legendary 1964 Moscow excerpts of Nilsson's absolutely amazing Turandot. What we have here is the riddle scene and the final duet, amounting to about 30 minutes. Nilsson is Turandot and Prevergi is Calaf here. Nilsson's Turandot here, it is miraculous. absolutely miraculous. The first time I listened to this, I put on earphones, put this to the biggest volume, and the way she absolutely blasts the quel grado and the high C at the end of In Questa Regia, it blows you away how incredibly Nilsson could just blast a laser beam out of her throat. You know, any theater would have collapsed under that high C, and don't talk about Prevedi. Um, he just stood there. He didn't even open his mouth to sing. He just let Nilsson blast that high C over him. And because, I mean, it speaks for itself. That note, that high C, is absolutely incredible. The way here in Moscow, she just doesn't care about anything and just blasts those metallic high notes out of her throat is incredible. There's been nothing that has ever come close to the size and the explosiveness of this Moscow Turandot. And Prevedi here as Kalav, probably under the influence of Nilsson's miraculous performance, is much more convincing, much more heroic, and virile when compared to his Covent Garden the year before, and he doesn't match Nilsson obviously in terms of the size of the voice, but he still sounds very heroic and virile in both of these excerpts. Yeah, there is, this full recording is on sale on a few websites, but I haven't bought any of these, and I have my doubts whether or not they're actually the real thing or just different recordings spliced together. But these 30 minutes are genuine, and Nilsson is an absolutely fantastic form here, and that high C at the end of In Questa Regia is possibly the best high C that anyone has ever sung, and it's Becky Nilsson. Then we have a few excerpts of Anne Roselle singing the role of Turandot. She recorded In Questa Regia and Del Primo Pianto, both in German and in Italian. The first set from 1926 are in German, and the second set are in Italian. So, what we'll take away from Roselle's Turandot from these, 4 excerpts to each. Her In Questa Regia is absolutely incredible. In German, with the orchestral accompaniment, it's a nuanced, a very mysterious, enigmatic Turandot with a lot of nuance here and there. A veiled quality with not much metallic, blasting in the sound. However, in the voice there is a lot of nuance, a lot of seductiveness in the voice of her In Questa Regia. Same goes to her Del Primo Pianto. These two are in German in 1926. She's in fresher voice here, orchestral accompaniment. Then we have 2 from 1948. These are in Italian, and it's recorded in her house with a piano accompaniment. But she is not in any worse voice here as well. She sings this in Italian. There's more Italian quality to it. There's more chest voice. There's more Italian red hot quality of Turandot, but the veiled quality, the kind of enigmatic Turandot sound is still there. It's really an oriental enigmatic princess instead of just blasting it all out. And I honestly prefer her 1948, sets in Italian, even though it's way past her prime, and it's a non-professional recording just done with a piano at her home. I really appreciate the 48 recordings more because even though she's old, she's past her prime, her voice didn't decline at all. Her vocalism is still there, and she puts on a more red hot quality, one that isn't necessarily dramatic in nature, and I think is the closest to what Puccini would have wanted for his Turandot to sound. It's the closest we can get to hearing Rosa Raisa do the role, and these two Italian excerpts of Roselle's Turandot from 1948 are absolutely invaluable. Then, for the aria of Nessun Dorma, I've chosen Giacomo Lauri Volpi and his 1934 version of the aria. Now, he's quite young here, relatively, and his voice had that fresh, exciting, impetuous quality, like Corelli did in his 1958 film recording. But Lauri Volpi had a much more beautiful and lyric timbre in nature. It is a lyric instrument with dramatic temperament, and that is what you want in this Nessun Dorma, this aria. An absolutely beautiful lyric legato flowing, and with that kind of impetuous, exciting, and youthful quality in the voice as well. The kind of fast vibrato helps it. It's impetuous, it's quite impatient, and that B natural at the very end is absolutely beautifully sung. The beautiful natural instrument, the lyric timbre of Lauri Volpi, with his dramatic Italian red hot spinto temperament, is just unbeatable for the aria of Nessun Dorma. Then we can contrast this one to another Nessun Dorma he sang 38 years after he recorded this. This is from 1972, live in a concert at Barcelona, and we have a video recording of this, and he is 80 here, but his voice is still perfect at the age of 80. There is, of course, there is this kind of vocal decline where his, voice became more loosened, but the solidity of the voice, the timbre, the natural timbre, and the dramatic temperament never changed over 40 years. He is over 80 here. He's 80, and for some reason his voice is still intact, incredibly intact, and the B natural he does at the end of the aria is still perfect. It's spot on for someone to sing a perfect B natural at the age of 80 after doing all the biggest roles in the Italian repertory is incredible. And this is something only Giacomo Lauri Volpi could have done. And again, we have the video recording adding to the artistic value. You can see, Lauri Volpi on stage. His stage presence is just incredible and absolutely, absolutely perfect. Perfect Nessun Dormas by Lauri Volpi. I know that I've used up all 5 slots in the, good excerpts category, and this isn't part of the 5 for obvious reasons, but I wanted to include this as a bonus. Why? This is Luciano Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma in 1994 in the Three Tenors concert. I know I've talked about how Pavarotti and his Nessun Dorma is a mess and all of that, but if you just take into this consideration only this aria in a concert setting, I think I could get past it, because this Nessun Dorma, 1994, conducted by Zubin Mehta in the Three Tenors concert from LA, 2 years ago when I first got into opera, I listened to this obsessively, like 5 times a day. And to this day, I still think that kind of beautiful, natural timbre of Pavarotti, here he isn't trying to sound heroic as he did in the studio recording with Mehta. He's just trying to sing this beautiful Puccinian aria with this beautiful natural timbre, and in a concert setting it works for me. And to this day, I mean, after listening to so many great Nessun Dormas by so many great tenors, obviously this is going to pale in comparison, but it holds a special value for me in my heart, because this is how I got into opera. It's the first thing I've ever seen, and I really like it. I really love it, because he really sounds emotional in this aria, and that B natural at the end is very beautifully sung. And the artistic value of this is that, this was posted 3 years ago on YouTube, and it has 44 million views. So potentially 44 million people got into opera through this. So I mean, the artistic value of this is undoubtedly very, very great. And although the singing itself isn't that great, I still really, really treasure this performance for obvious reasons. So this concludes the video of Turandot and its recordings. And I know it's been very, very long, but this is just an opera that has so many great recordings, so many things to talk about. And I will see you soon in my next review, which will be for Tristano and Isolde. See you then, and peace out.